Imagine walking through life untouched, calm in chaos, unshaken by judgment, immune to insult. What if no one could truly bother you? Carl Jung believed that the people who irritate us the most are mirrors, reflections of what we refuse to see in ourselves. Today, we'll journey into Jung's hidden psychology of anger, shadow, and inner freedom to finally master the art of emotional invincibility. Before we start, comment where you're watching from. Subscribe. Tomorrow's story is even crazier. You're sitting in your car, gripping the steering wheel until your knuckles turn white. The traffic light has been red for what feels like an eternity, and the driver in front of you is texting, oblivious to the world around them. When the light finally turns green, they don't move. Not for 3 seconds. Not for 5. Your chest tightens, your jaw clenches. The horn erupts from your car like a primal scream. Move! You shout at the windshield, as if your fury could somehow penetrate their consciousness. But here's the strange thing about this moment, and perhaps you've never noticed it before. The intensity of your rage far exceeds the crime. A few seconds of delay. That's all it was. Yet your entire nervous system has activated as if you're under mortal threat. Your heart pounds. Adrenaline floods your bloodstream. Your mind races with angry thoughts about inconsiderate people, about how the world is falling apart, about how no one cares anymore. This is the storm within. And it's been raging inside you far longer than you realize. Think about yesterday, or last week. How many times did someone or something trigger this same volcanic response? The cashier who moved too slowly. The colleague who interrupted you in the meeting. The neighbor whose dog barked too early in the morning. The news anchor whose opinions made your blood boil. The friend who didn't respond to your text quickly enough. Each time, you probably told yourself the same story. They are the problem. They are rude, inconsiderate, ignorant, or wrong. They are disrupting your peace, stealing your joy, ruining your day. If only they would change. If only they would be different. Then you could finally be happy. But what if I told you that this entire narrative, this whole elaborate story you've been telling yourself about others, is actually a magnificent illusion? What if the very people who anger you most are not your enemies, but your greatest teachers? What if every person who triggers you is actually holding up a mirror, showing you something about yourself that you've been desperately trying not to see? This isn't just philosophical speculation. This is the beginning of a journey that could fundamentally transform how you experience life. Because once you understand what's really happening in these moments of irritation and rage, you'll discover something extraordinary. The key to your own freedom has been in your hands all along. Right now, as you listen to these words, you might be thinking about someone who particularly gets under your skin. Perhaps it's a family member whose political views make you want to scream. Maybe it's a coworker whose habits drive you to distraction. Or perhaps it's a public figure whose very existence seems to offend everything you stand for. Feel that familiar surge of emotion as you think about them. Notice how your body responds, the tightening in your chest, the heat rising in your face. The way your thoughts begin to spiral into judgment and criticism. This is not random. This is not accidental. This is your psyche trying to tell you something crucial about yourself. The ancient Greeks had a word for this kind of self-knowledge, gnothi souton, know thyself. It was inscribed at the temple of Apollo at Delphi, considered the most important wisdom a human being could possess. But knowing yourself is perhaps the most difficult task we face as conscious beings. Why? Because much of who we are remains hidden from our own view, buried in what psychologists call the unconscious mind. We like to think we're self-aware. We believe we understand our own motivations, our own character, our own flaws and virtues. But the truth is far more complex and far more humbling. There are parts of ourselves, significant parts, that we cannot see directly. We can only glimpse them in reflection, in the responses they create in the world around us. And this is where other people become invaluable, not as sources of irritation, but as mirrors. Every strong emotional reaction you have to another person is actually information about yourself. Every judgment you make, every criticism you level, every moment of anger or frustration, these are not primarily about them. They are about you. this might be difficult to accept. Your ego, that part of your mind that maintains your self-image and protects your identity, will resist this idea with everything it has. It will insist that your anger is justified, that your judgments are accurate, that other people really are the problem. The ego's job is to maintain the illusion that you are separate from what you dislike, that you are better than what you criticize, that you are innocent of what you condemn. But what if you could step outside of the ego's protective narrative, just for a moment? What if you could observe your own reactions with the curiosity of a scientist studying a fascinating phenomenon? What would you discover about yourself? Consider this. The qualities that most irritate you in others are often the very qualities you fear most in yourself. The person whose arrogance makes your skin crawl might be reflecting your own hidden pride. The individual whose neediness drives you crazy might be showing you your own unacknowledged vulnerability. The colleague whose laziness infuriates you might be mirroring your own avoided responsibilities. This doesn't mean you should excuse harmful behavior or abandon all standards and boundaries. It means you can use your emotional reactions as a compass, pointing you toward the hidden territories of your own consciousness. It means you can transform every irritation into an opportunity for self-discovery, every frustration into a pathway to greater self-awareness. The storm within isn't caused by the world outside. The storm within is created by the collision between reality and your unconscious expectations, your hidden fears, your denied aspects of self. Understanding this is the first step toward finding the eye of the storm, that place of perfect calm that exists at the center of every tempest. So the next time someone triggers that familiar surge of anger, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, what is this person showing me about myself? The answer might surprise you. It might challenge you. But most importantly, it might free you. You've probably heard the name Carl Jung before, perhaps in a psychology class, or mentioned in a documentary, or referenced by someone discussing dreams or personality types. But Jung was far more than an academic figure confined to textbooks. He was an explorer of the human soul, a mapmaker of consciousness, a guide into the hidden dimensions of the self. Born in Switzerland in 1875, Jung dedicated his life to understanding why human beings suffer, not just from external circumstances, but from internal conflicts that seem to have no clear resolution. He worked with patients who appeared to have everything they needed for happiness, yet found themselves tormented by inexplicable anxiety, depression, and rage. He studied myths, religions, and fairy tales from cultures around the world, discovering that the same psychological patterns appeared again and again across time and geography. What Jung discovered was revolutionary. Much of human suffering comes not from what we know about ourselves, but from what we refuse to know. He called this hidden aspect of personality the shadow. The shadow is not evil, though it's often misunderstood this way. The shadow is simply the collection of all the parts of yourself that you've learned to reject, deny, or repress. It contains not only your potential for destructiveness, but also your capacity for creativity, passion, and authentic power. It holds your anger, yes, but also your wildness, your sexuality, your spontaneity, your ability to say no, your capacity for righteous indignation. Think about the process of growing up. As a child, you expressed yourself spontaneously. You cried when you were hurt, screamed when you were angry, laughed when you were delighted. You were unfiltered, authentic, whole. But gradually, you learned that certain aspects of yourself were unacceptable to the people whose love and approval you needed to survive. Perhaps you learned that anger was dangerous, so you pushed it down. Maybe you discovered that vulnerability made others uncomfortable, so you buried your sensitivity. You might have been taught that certain desires were shameful, so you locked them away. Piece by piece, you constructed a persona, a mask that displayed only the qualities that were deemed acceptable, successful, lovable. This persona became your identity. You began to believe that you actually were this edited version of yourself. The rejected parts didn't disappear, though. They went underground, into the realm Jung called the unconscious. There they remained, growing in the darkness, influencing your behavior in ways you couldn't see. This is why Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The qualities that most strongly trigger your emotional reactions are usually the very qualities you've banished to your shadow. When you see them expressed in another person, your unconscious mind recognizes them immediately. But instead of acknowledging this recognition, your ego experiences it as a threat. It must be rejected, criticized, attacked. The arrogant person reminds you of your own hidden pride. The needy person reflects your own disowned vulnerability. The angry person mirrors your own suppressed rage. The lazy person shows you your own avoided responsibilities. The judgmental person reveals your own critical nature. This doesn't mean that every criticism you have of others is pure projection. Sometimes people really are behaving badly, and your response is appropriate and proportional. But when your reaction is disproportionately intense, when you find yourself obsessing about someone's behavior, when you feel compelled to constantly talk about how wrong they are, when thinking about them creates a surge of emotion that seems to take over your entire system, that's when projection is likely at work. Jung discovered that this unconscious projection of the shadow onto others is one of the primary sources of human conflict. It's why marriages break down, why families become estranged, why communities split apart, why nations go to war. We're not usually fighting other people, we're fighting aspects of ourselves that we can't bear to acknowledge. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly liberating. Projection is not a flaw to be overcome, but a natural psychological mechanism that can become a tool for self-discovery. Your strong reactions to others are actually your psyche's way of trying to show you what you've lost, what you've denied, what needs to be reclaimed and integrated. The shadow doesn't want to remain hidden forever. It wants to be seen, understood, accepted back into the wholeness of who you are. Every person who triggers you is actually serving as an agent of your own unconscious, trying to help you recognize and reclaim these lost parts of yourself. This is Jung's hidden door, the secret passage that leads from external conflict to internal integration. But opening this door requires courage, because it means facing aspects of yourself that you've spent years, maybe decades, trying to avoid. It means admitting that you're not quite who you thought you were. It means expanding your self-concept to include qualities you've considered unacceptable. The reward for this courage is extraordinary. The end of projection means the end of being unconsciously controlled by others. When you stop needing to reject aspects of yourself, you stop being triggered by those same aspects in other people. You become free to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be compelled, to love rather than judge. Jung called this process individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming complete. It's about integrating all aspects of yourself, light and dark, acceptable and unacceptable, conscious and unconscious, into a unified, authentic whole. This journey begins with a simple but profound shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with them?" you begin to ask, "What is this showing me about myself?" This single question can transform every relationship, every conflict, every moment of emotional reactivity into an opportunity for greater self-knowledge and personal growth. The door is always there, waiting for you to notice it. The key has always been in your hand. The question is, are you ready to turn it? The enemy has been living inside your house all along. Not hiding in the basement or lurking in the attic, but sitting at your dinner table, sleeping in your bed, looking back at you from every mirror. The enemy is not separate from you. It is you. Or more precisely, it's the parts of you that you've declared inadmissible to your conscious identity. This might be the most difficult truth to accept about human psychology. We are often our own greatest adversary. Not because we're fundamentally flawed or evil, but because we've become split against ourselves, at war with our own nature. We've created an internal exile system, banishing aspects of our personality to psychological Siberia, then wondering why we feel incomplete, why we keep getting triggered by the same types of people, why our relationships follow the same painful patterns. Let me tell you about Sarah, a meditation teacher who prided herself on her patience and compassion. She had spent years cultivating inner peace, attending retreats, studying Buddhist philosophy. She genuinely believed she had transcended anger, until she found herself working with a colleague named Marcus, whose aggressive communication style and need to dominate every conversation made her blood boil. "He's everything that's wrong with masculine energy," she would tell her friends. "Pushy, egotistical, completely unaware of how he affects others. He triggers everyone in the office. Someone needs to tell him how inappropriate his behavior is." Sarah became obsessed with Marcus's flaws. She analyzed his every interaction, collected examples of his insensitivity, built a detailed case for why he was problematic. She couldn't understand why she was so affected by him when she had worked so hard to become peaceful and non-reactive. What Sarah couldn't see was that Marcus was reflecting back to her the very qualities she had most fiercely rejected in herself: her own capacity for aggression, her own desire for power and recognition, her own ability to take up space unapologetically. As a woman in a culture that often punishes female assertiveness, she had learned early to suppress these qualities. They became unacceptable to her self-image as a spiritual, compassionate person. But the shadow doesn't disappear when we reject it. It simply operates unconsciously. Sarah's suppressed aggression leaked out in passive-aggressive comments, in her obsessive criticism of Marcus, in her need to recruit others to validate her judgment of him. She was fighting the very war she claimed to have transcended, but she couldn't see it because she was fighting it through projection. This is how projection works. It takes the internal conflict and externalizes it, making it seem like the problem is out there, instead of in here. It's a psychological defense mechanism that protects the ego from having to face uncomfortable truths about itself. But like all defense mechanisms, it comes with a cost. It keeps us trapped in patterns of reactivity and judgment that perpetuate exactly the kind of suffering we're trying to avoid. Think about your own life. Who are the people who most consistently push your buttons? What qualities do they possess that create that familiar surge of irritation or disgust? Make a mental list. Be specific. The arrogance, the neediness, the selfishness, the laziness, the victim mentality, the control issues, the emotional volatility. Now comes the challenging part. What if these qualities that you find so intolerable in others actually exist within you as well? Not necessarily in the same obvious form, but in some version, some degree, some hidden manifestation? Your ego will immediately protest this suggestion. "I'm nothing like that person," it will insist. "I would never behave that way. That's exactly what I'm not." But this very vehemence, this emotional charge around the denial, is often a sign that you've hit upon something significant. The qualities we most passionately reject in others are usually the qualities we most fear in ourselves. We see them clearly in others precisely because we know them intimately from the inside. We recognize them because we've been vigilantly guarding against them in ourselves. This doesn't mean you should start behaving like the people who trigger you. It means you should start acknowledging that you have the capacity for all human qualities, both those you admire and those you despise. You have the potential for selfishness and generosity, for cruelty and kindness, for wisdom and foolishness, for courage and cowardice. Carl Jung put it this way: everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. When we refuse to acknowledge our capacity for certain qualities, they don't disappear, they grow stronger in the darkness of the unconscious, eventually expressing themselves in ways we can't control or don't recognize. The person who is obsessed with honesty may be compensating for their own hidden dishonesty. The individual who constantly criticizes others for being judgmental may be the most judgmental person in the room. The one who prides themselves on their independence may be terrified of their own neediness. The person who seems so calm and peaceful may be sitting on a volcano of unexpressed rage. This is not about moral judgment. It's about psychological wholeness. When you can acknowledge that you contain all human potentials, when you can own your capacity for both light and dark, you stop being controlled by these qualities unconsciously. You stop projecting them onto others. You become free to choose how to express them consciously and appropriately. The businessman who acknowledges his own capacity for laziness stops being triggered by his lazy employees and starts being curious about what that laziness might be telling him about their needs or his management style. The mother who owns her own selfishness stops being outraged by her selfish teenage daughter and starts seeing opportunities to teach healthy boundaries and self-care. Integration doesn't mean acting out every impulse or abandoning all standards. It means bringing the shadow qualities into consciousness where they can be examined, understood, and channeled constructively, rather than allowing them to operate destructively from the unconscious. Your anger at others' arrogance can become healthy self-confidence. Your disgust at others' neediness can become compassion for human vulnerability. Your irritation at others' control issues can become awareness of your own need for security and predictability. The enemy inside is not your enemy at all. It's the exiled king or queen of your psyche, waiting to be welcomed home. When you stop fighting these aspects of yourself through others, when you stop trying to maintain your self-image by rejecting parts of your humanity, something extraordinary happens. You become whole. And from wholeness comes a peace that no external circumstance can disturb, because it's no longer dependent on others being different than they are. You've made peace with yourself, which means you can finally make peace with the world. There comes a moment in every journey of awakening when the seeker stops seeking outside themselves and turns inward. It's a subtle shift, barely perceptible at first, like the barely detectable change in light that signals dawn is coming. You might not even notice it happening. But suddenly, in the middle of feeling triggered by someone's behavior, you pause, and instead of immediately launching into your familiar internal monologue about what's wrong with them, you find yourself asking a different question: why is this affecting me so much? This is the birth of awareness. This is the moment when you begin to step outside the unconscious machinery of projection and reaction and become curious about your own psychological processes. It's the moment when you stop being the victim of your triggers and start becoming the investigator of them. You're driving again, and someone cuts you off in traffic. But this time, instead of immediately flooding with rage and cursing their inconsideration, you notice something fascinating. Your reaction happens in layers. First comes the physical response, the adrenaline, the tension, the activation of your nervous system. Then comes the emotional response, the anger, the indignation, the sense of being wronged. Finally comes the mental response, the story you tell yourself about what just happened and what it means about the other driver, about society, about your day. But now you're watching all of this unfold as if you're sitting in a theater observing a play. You're still feeling the emotions, still experiencing the physical sensations, but there's also this new presence, an observer self that can witness the whole process without being completely consumed by it. This observer self is what many spiritual traditions call the witness consciousness. It's the part of you that can watch your thoughts without being your thoughts, feel your emotions without being your emotions, experience your reactions without being controlled by your reactions. It's always been there, but it gets obscured by the drama of ego and projection. As you begin to cultivate this witness consciousness, you start to notice patterns in your triggers that you've never seen before. You realize that the same types of people push your buttons in the same ways, again and again. The details change, but the underlying dynamics remain surprisingly consistent. Perhaps you notice that you're particularly triggered by people who seem to get attention easily, while you've always had to work hard for recognition. Or maybe you find yourself most irritated by individuals who express their emotions freely, while you've always prided yourself on being controlled and rational. Or you might discover that you're most judgmental of people who seem selfish, while you've built your identity around being helpful and giving. These patterns are not random. They're actually your psyche's way of trying to show you where your internal splits are located. Every consistent trigger is pointing to a place where you've rejected some aspect of your own humanity. It's like having a psychological GPS system that's constantly trying to guide you toward wholeness, but you've been interpreting the directions as attacks from the outside world. This shift in perspective, from being triggered to being curious, doesn't happen overnight. The ego has spent years, maybe decades, perfecting its projection system. It won't give up this defensive strategy easily. There will be many times when you fall back into the old patterns of blame and judgment, but each time you catch yourself, each time you remember to pause and ask, "What is this showing me about myself?" You strengthen the observer consciousness. You begin to develop what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking, to be aware of your awareness. This is one of the most profound capacities human beings possess, and it's the foundation of all psychological growth and spiritual development. With metacognition comes the realization that you are not your thoughts or your emotions or your reactions. You are the consciousness that experiences all of these phenomena. This distinction is crucial because it means you don't have to be controlled by your triggers. You can experience them, learn from them, and choose how to respond to them. The birth of awareness also brings with it a certain humility. As you begin to see how much of your emotional reactivity has been based on projection rather than objective assessment, you start to question other certainties you've held about yourself and others. You realize that your perspective is far more subjective than you thought, that your judgments are far more revealing of your internal state than the external reality you thought you were accurately perceiving. This can be initially unsettling. If your anger at others isn't completely justified, if your judgments aren't entirely accurate, if your reactions are revealing more about you than about them, then what can you trust? What is real? What is true? The answer is both humbling and liberating. What you can trust is your capacity to be aware, to observe, to learn. What is real is your consciousness itself. What is true is that every experience, every trigger, every emotional reaction is an opportunity to know yourself more deeply. This doesn't mean that you should never trust your perceptions or that other people's behavior is never problematic. It means that your strongest emotional reactions are usually pointing to something within yourself that deserves your attention. It means that before you try to change or judge others, you might want to investigate what they're showing you about your own unconscious material. As this awareness grows, you start to experience a profound shift in your relationship to conflict and difficulty. Instead of seeing challenging people as obstacles to your peace, you begin to see them as teachers. Instead of experiencing your triggers as evidence that the world is against you, you start to recognize them as invitations to greater self-knowledge. The person who irritates you with their neediness might be showing you your own disowned vulnerability. The individual who frustrates you with their arrogance might be reflecting your own hidden pride. The colleague who drives you crazy with their disorganization might be mirroring your own rejected spontaneity. Each trigger becomes a gift, disguised as an annoyance. Each difficult person becomes a messenger from your unconscious, bringing you information about aspects of yourself that are ready to be integrated. Each moment of emotional reactivity becomes an opportunity to reclaim another piece of your projected shadow. This is the birth of awareness, the moment when you stop being unconsciously controlled by your triggers and start using them consciously for your own growth and liberation. It's the moment when you begin to transform from being a victim of your reactions into being a student of your own consciousness. And with this awareness comes the first taste of real freedom, not the freedom to control others or to make them conform to your preferences, but the freedom to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be compelled, to love rather than judge. The light is beginning to break through the fog. The journey toward wholeness has begun. Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Let it out slowly, allowing your shoulders to drop and your jaw to soften. Take another breath, this one even deeper, and as you exhale, imagine releasing all the tension you've been carrying about other people's behavior. Now, bring to mind someone who has triggered you recently. Perhaps it's the colleague who interrupted you in yesterday's meeting, or the family member whose political posts on social media make your blood boil, or the neighbor whose habits consistently irritate you. Choose someone whose behavior creates a strong emotional response in you: anger, frustration, disgust, or indignation. See their face in your mind's eye. Notice what happens in your body as their image appears. Do you feel a tightening in your chest, a clenching in your jaw, a surge of heat rising in your face? Simply observe these sensations without trying to change them. Your body is giving you valuable information. Now, instead of focusing on what they did wrong or how they should change, I want you to get curious about your reaction. Imagine that your emotional response is a messenger carrying important news about you, not about them. What might this messenger be trying to tell you? If you're angry at their arrogance, what might this reveal about your own relationship with confidence and self-assertion? If you're frustrated by their neediness, what might this show you about your own discomfort with vulnerability? If you're irritated by their selfishness, what might this illuminate about your own hidden desires for recognition or care? This isn't about making excuses for harmful behavior or abandoning appropriate boundaries. This is about using your emotional reactions as a compass, pointing you toward hidden aspects of your own psyche that are ready to be explored and integrated. Breathe again, and ask yourself, what quality in this person triggers me the most? Be specific. Is it their tendency to dominate conversations? Their need for constant validation? Their apparent disregard for others' feelings? Their ability to express anger freely? Their seeming lack of responsibility? Now comes the challenging part. Can you find this same quality somewhere within yourself? Not necessarily in the same obvious form, but perhaps in a more subtle manifestation? Maybe you don't dominate conversations verbally, but do you dominate them mentally, planning what you'll say next instead of really listening? Maybe you don't seek validation as obviously, but do you carefully manage your image to ensure others' approval? Maybe you don't disregard others' feelings directly, but do you sometimes prioritize your own comfort over others' needs? If your ego is protesting right now, saying, "I'm nothing like that person," simply notice the protest without arguing with it. The ego's job is to maintain your self-image, to protect you from seeing aspects of yourself that might challenge your identity. But growth happens in the space between who you think you are and who you actually are. Breathe into any discomfort you might be feeling. This exploration isn't meant to diminish you or make you feel bad about yourself. It's meant to expand your self-awareness and reclaim parts of yourself that have been split off and projected onto others. Consider this possibility. What if the quality that most irritates you in this other person is actually a part of yourself that has been exiled to your shadow? What if this person is serving as a mirror, reflecting back to you an aspect of your own nature that you've learned to reject or deny? This rejected quality isn't necessarily bad or wrong. It might be a natural human capacity that you learned to suppress because it wasn't acceptable in your family, your culture, or your self-concept. The arrogance you see in others might actually be healthy self-confidence that you were taught to hide. The neediness you find so annoying might be natural human vulnerability that you learned was unsafe to express. The selfishness you judge so harshly might be appropriate self-care that you never learned to practice. Imagine what it would be like to reclaim this quality in a healthy, integrated way. If the person's confidence triggers you, what would it feel like to access your own authentic self-assurance? If their emotional expressiveness bothers you, what would it be like to honor your own feelings more fully? If their boundary-setting skills irritate you, what would it feel like to say no when you need to? As you explore these possibilities, notice any shifts in your feelings toward the person who triggered you. Do they seem less threatening, less irritating, more human? This is what happens when you stop projecting your shadow onto others and start owning it as part of yourself. The intense emotional charge begins to dissipate because you're no longer unconsciously fighting yourself through them. This doesn't mean you have to like everyone or approve of all behavior. It means you can respond to others from a place of choice rather than compulsion, awareness rather than unconscious reactivity. You can set boundaries when necessary, address problems when appropriate, and remove yourself from harmful situations, all without the intense emotional charge that comes from projection. Take another deep breath and imagine meeting this person with this new awareness. See yourself interacting with them not as someone who threatens your peace, but as someone who has given you a gift of self-knowledge. Feel the difference in your body when you approach them from curiosity rather than judgment, from wholeness rather than internal conflict. This is the beginning of a new way of being in the world. Every person who triggers you becomes a teacher. Every moment of reactivity becomes an opportunity for growth. Every conflict becomes a chance to reclaim another piece of your projected shadow and step closer to psychological wholeness. Remember these words as you go forth. The war ends when you stop fighting your reflection. Every enemy outside is actually an aspect of yourself waiting to come home. Every trigger is a doorway to greater self-knowledge. Every irritation is an invitation to love yourself more completely. Open your eyes when you're ready, and carry this awareness with you into your daily life. The mirrors are everywhere, waiting to show you the fullness of who you really are. If this part got you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now. Imagine a medieval castle, its massive stone walls rising against the sky, built to withstand any siege. Towers stand sentinel at each corner, archers positioned at every window, ready to rain arrows down upon any approaching threat. The drawbridge is pulled up, the moat is filled with dangers, and the gates are barred with iron. This is a fortress designed for one purpose: to protect what lies within from any force that might seek to destroy it. This castle is your ego, and like any fortress, it was built in response to perceived threats. The ego, in Carl Jung's understanding, is not the villain that popular spirituality often makes it out to be. It's not something to be destroyed or transcended. The ego is actually a necessary and valuable part of your psychological architecture, the organizing principle of your conscious mind, the part of you that creates coherence out of the chaos of experience, the aspect of your psyche that allows you to function in the world as a separate, autonomous individual. But like any defensive structure, the ego can become so focused on protection that it loses sight of what it was originally designed to protect. It can become so rigid in its defenses that it creates the very isolation and conflict it was meant to prevent. Think about how your own ego fortress was constructed. In early childhood, you were completely vulnerable, utterly dependent on others for survival. Your very sense of self was fragile, still forming, easily shattered by criticism, rejection, or abandonment. So your psyche began building walls. Every time you were hurt, disappointed, or made to feel ashamed, another stone was added to the ramparts. You learned to present only the aspects of yourself that were rewarded with love, approval, and safety. The parts that were met with disapproval, punishment, or indifference were hidden behind the walls, banished to the shadow where they couldn't threaten your carefully constructed identity. The ego became the architect of this split, maintaining the acceptable public self while keeping the rejected aspects safely locked away. But here's where the ego's protective strategy becomes problematic. It doesn't just defend against external threats, it also defends against internal ones. Any person, situation, or experience that reminds the ego of those rejected aspects of self is immediately perceived as an enemy to be defeated. Consider Margaret, a successful executive who has built her identity around being competent, efficient, and always in control. She learned early in life that vulnerability was dangerous, that showing weakness invited exploitation or abandonment, so she constructed an ego fortress around strength, competence, and self-reliance. Margaret works with a colleague named David who is openly emotional, frequently asks for help, and sometimes admits when he doesn't know something. Whenever David displays these qualities, Margaret feels an almost violent surge of irritation. She finds herself obsessing about his unprofessional behavior, building elaborate cases for why he's unsuited for his position, recruiting others to validate her assessment of his inadequacy. What Margaret can't see is that David is not actually threatening her professional position or her success. He's threatening her ego's carefully constructed fortress. His vulnerability reminds her unconscious mind of her own disowned neediness. His emotional expressiveness reflects back the feelings she's learned to suppress. His willingness to admit ignorance challenges her compulsive need to appear knowledgeable. The ego fortress goes into full defensive mode. The archers, her judgmental thoughts, begin firing. The soldiers, her critical comments and undermining behaviors, march out to attack. The entire fortress mobilizes to defend against this perceived threat to its walls. But here's the tragic irony. The very defenses that once protected Margaret's developing psyche are now imprisoning her adult self. The walls that kept out childhood harm are also keeping out adult connection. The fortress that once provided safety is now creating the isolation and conflict she most fears. This is how the ego's protective mechanism becomes a source of suffering, It continues to fight battles that ended long ago, against enemies that exist primarily in projection. It maintains vigilance against threats to an identity that no longer needs such rigid protection. The ego fortress is particularly threatened by what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for any psychological position to eventually transform into its opposite. The person who builds their identity around being good inevitably encounters their capacity for selfishness. The individual who prides themselves on being rational will eventually face their emotional nature. The one who defines themselves through strength will eventually meet their vulnerability. These encounters with our opposite nature feel like existential threats to the ego. They challenge the very foundation of who we think we are. So the ego projects these threatening qualities onto others, making them external enemies to be fought rather than internal aspects to be integrated. This projection serves a dual purpose. It maintains the ego's sense of being separate from and superior to what it rejects, while simultaneously providing a target for the unexpressed energy of the shadow. The ego gets to feel righteous in its judgment, while unconsciously expressing the very qualities it claims to despise. But projection is ultimately unsustainable. It requires enormous psychological energy to maintain these splits, to constantly monitor for threats, to perpetually defend against reminders of our rejected aspects. It creates a state of chronic vigilance that exhausts the psyche and isolates the individual from authentic connection with others. The ego fortress, originally built for protection, becomes a prison. The walls that were meant to keep danger out begin to keep life itself at bay. The defenses that once preserved the developing self begin to constrain the adult's capacity for growth, intimacy, and wholeness. Yet this fortress need not be torn down. Jung understood that the ego's protective function remains valuable throughout life. We need boundaries, identity, and the capacity to function as separate individuals. The goal is not to destroy the ego fortress, but to make its walls more permeable, its defenses more flexible, its responses more conscious and appropriate, to present circumstances rather than past traumas. This transformation begins with recognition. When you feel that familiar surge of irritation or judgment toward another person, you can learn to recognize it as the ego fortress going into defensive mode. You can become curious about what perceived threat has activated the ancient alarm system. You can ask yourself, what is this person reminding me of that I've rejected in myself? The ego fortress was built by a child who needed protection, but you are no longer that vulnerable child. You have resources now that you didn't have then: perspective, choice, the capacity to set healthy boundaries without building impermeable walls. You can honor the ego's protective impulse while no longer being controlled by its antiquated defense strategies. The drawbridge can be lowered. The archers can stand down. The fortress can become not a prison, but a home base from which you venture forth into authentic relationship with the world and with the fullness of yourself. When the ego no longer needs to maintain its rigid defenses against the shadow, when it no longer needs to project rejected aspects onto others, when it can relax its vigilant guard against imagined threats, then it can serve its true function, not as a fortress against life, but as a stable foundation for living. The scream that erupts from your throat when someone cuts you off in traffic carries within it the echo of every time you felt powerless, every moment you've been dismissed, every instance when your needs were ignored or invalidated. That surge of rage that seems so disproportionate to the immediate trigger, it's not just about the traffic incident. It's about the accumulation of every wound that taught you the world is unsafe, that other people can't be trusted, that you must constantly defend your right to exist. Anger, in its raw and immediate form, is actually one of our most honest emotions. It doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend. It rises from the depths of our being, like a messenger, carrying urgent news about what has been violated, what has been threatened, what needs attention and protection. But the message it carries is rarely about the present moment. More often, it's delivering information about unhealed wounds from the past that are still bleeding beneath the surface of consciousness. Think about the last time you experienced intense anger, not just irritation or annoyance, but the kind of rage that flooded your entire system, that made your hands shake and your voice rise. Now ask yourself, was your reaction proportionate to what actually happened in that moment? Or did it seem to carry a weight, an intensity, a desperation that suggested something much larger was at stake? This is the nature of what psychologists call triggered responses. When our present circumstances resonate with unresolved experiences from our past, the emotional charge from those earlier wounds gets activated and discharged into the current situation. We're not just responding to what's happening now, we're responding to what happened then, and then, and then. All the accumulated pain that never received adequate attention, healing, or resolution. Consider the story of James, a middle-aged man who found himself exploding with rage whenever his teenage son challenged his authority. On the surface, his anger seemed to be about respect, about appropriate boundaries between parent and child. But as James began to explore his reactions more deeply, he discovered something more complex. James had grown up with a father who ruled through intimidation and control. Any sign of independence or questioning from young James was met with harsh punishment or emotional withdrawal. James learned to survive by becoming compliant, by suppressing his own opinions and desires, by making himself small enough to avoid triggering his father's wrath. Now, decades later, when his own son displayed the healthy adolescent tendency to push boundaries and assert independence, James's nervous system interpreted this as the same threat he had experienced as a child. The wound of powerlessness, of having his autonomy crushed, began to bleed. But instead of feeling the original pain of being dominated, James unconsciously identified with the aggressor. He became the intimidating father, using anger as a weapon to maintain control and avoid feeling the vulnerability he had experienced in childhood. This is how wounds perpetuate themselves across generations. The child who was shamed for being emotional becomes the adult who shames others for their feelings. The girl who was criticized for being too much becomes the woman who judges other women for taking up space. The boy who was abandoned by his father becomes the man who abandons others before they can abandon him. But anger as a messenger isn't inherently destructive. When we can learn to listen to its communication rather than simply expressing it reactively, it becomes a powerful tool for self-understanding and healing. Every surge of rage is actually your psyche trying to protect something valuable: your sense of worth, your need for safety, your right to be seen and respected. The problem arises when we don't distinguish between the message and the messenger, when we mistake the emotion for the truth of the present situation. Your anger might be telling you that your boundaries have been violated, but that doesn't necessarily mean the person in front of you is the violator. Your rage might be signaling that you feel dismissed or invalidated, but that doesn't automatically mean the current situation warrants that interpretation. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of what he called holding the tension of the opposites. Instead of immediately acting on anger or suppressing it entirely, we can learn to hold space for both the emotion and our conscious understanding of the present moment. We can feel the rage fully while also questioning its origins and appropriateness. Maria discovered this principle when she began exploring her intense anger toward her sister-in-law, Carmen. Every family gathering became a battleground, with Maria finding fault with everything Carmen said or did. Carmen's confidence irritated her. Carmen's success made her feel competitive. Carmen's close relationship with Maria's mother-in-law filled her with resentment. Through therapy, Maria began to recognize that Carmen was activating wounds from her relationship with her own sister, Elena. Growing up, Elena had been the favored child, more attractive, more academically successful, more socially confident. Maria had learned to cope with this by becoming the good one, the responsible one, the one who never caused problems. But beneath this adaptive strategy lay a deep well of hurt, jealousy, and rage that had never been acknowledged or processed. Carmen's presence in the family system was triggering this ancient wound. Every time Carmen received attention or praise, Maria's nervous system responded as if Elena was once again being favored while she was overlooked. The 50-year-old woman was reacting with the emotional intensity of the wounded child who had never had her pain acknowledged or healed. But once Maria recognized this pattern, she could begin to respond differently. Instead of attacking Carmen, she could tend to her own wound. Instead of demanding that Carmen change, she could grieve the childhood pain that had never received attention. Instead of projecting her unresolved sibling rivalry onto her current family relationships, she could work on healing her relationship with her own sister and, more importantly, with the hurt child within herself. This is the gift that conscious relationship with anger can provide. It becomes a diagnostic tool, pointing us toward exactly the places within ourselves that most need healing attention. Every person who triggers our rage is actually offering us a precise map to our unhealed wounds. Every situation that activates our fight or flight response is showing us where we're still carrying unresolved trauma. The goal is not to eliminate anger. That would be like shooting the messenger who brings urgent news. The goal is to become fluent in anger's language, to understand what it's trying to communicate, to distinguish between old wounds and present realities, to respond to the underlying need, rather than simply reacting to the emotional charge. When we can do this, anger transforms from a destructive force into a healing one. It becomes not the voice of our wounds, but the guardian of our wholeness. It protects what's sacred, while guiding us toward what needs attention. It honors both our past pain and our present capacity for choice. The wounds that shout through our anger are not our enemies. They are the voices of parts of ourselves that are still waiting to be heard, to be held, to be healed. When we can listen to them with compassion rather than fear, when we can tend to them with awareness rather than reactivity, they begin to transform from sources of unconscious compulsion into sources of conscious wisdom. Every judgment you make about another person is actually a confession about yourself. This might be one of the most difficult truths to accept about human psychology, but it's also one of the most liberating. When you point a finger at someone's flaws, 3 fingers are pointing back at you, not in accusation, but in invitation. They're inviting you to explore the hidden landscape of your own psyche, to discover the aspects of yourself that you've disowned and are now seeing reflected in the external world. Projection is perhaps the most pervasive and unconscious psychological mechanism humans employ. We do it constantly, automatically, without awareness. It's as natural as breathing, and often just as invisible. Yet understanding projection, how it works, why it happens, and how to recognize it, is essential for anyone seeking emotional freedom and authentic relationship. Jung described projection as the unconscious transfer of our own psychological material onto external objects or people. It's the psyche's way of making the internal external, of taking what we can't or won't see in ourselves and placing it out there where it feels safer to observe and judge. But projection is not just about negative qualities. We also project our unlived potentials, our disowned gifts, our unrecognized wisdom onto others. Think about the people you most admire. The qualities you find most inspiring in them, their creativity, their courage, their compassion, their authenticity. These are often reflections of your own potential that you haven't yet claimed or developed. You recognize these qualities in others because they resonate with something within yourself, something that's seeking expression and recognition. But it's the negative projections that create the most suffering, because they generate the judgments, conflicts, and emotional reactivity that dominate so much of human interaction. When you find yourself obsessively critical of someone, when you feel compelled to point out their flaws to others, when their very existence seems to irritate you, that's projection in action. Consider the phenomenon of moral outrage. Watch how people respond to news stories about behavior they find reprehensible. Notice the intensity of their reactions, the vehemence of their condemnation, the satisfaction they seem to derive from their righteous anger. This level of emotional charge rarely comes from objective assessment of right and wrong. It comes from projection. The person who is most outraged by infidelity is often struggling with their own sexual desires or fantasies that feel threatening to their self-image. The individual who rails against greed may be unconsciously conflicted about their own material desires. The one who condemns laziness most harshly often carries shame about their own need for rest and ease. This doesn't mean that all moral judgments are projections or that ethical standards don't matter. It means that when our moral responses carry an intense emotional charge, when they're accompanied by contempt or disgust, when they make us feel superior to those we're judging, that's usually a sign that something more complex is happening. Sarah discovered this when she found herself obsessively following news stories about a politician whose behavior filled her with rage. She would spend hours reading articles about his corruption, his lies, his apparent lack of empathy for those he was supposed to serve. She would share these articles on social media with angry commentary. She would discuss his failings with friends, building elaborate cases for his moral bankruptcy. But when Sarah began to examine her reaction more closely, she realized that her obsession with this politician's dishonesty was connected to her own complicated relationship with truth. She recognized that she often bent the truth in small ways, exaggerating her accomplishments, minimizing her mistakes, presenting herself in the best possible light in social situations. She had never thought of herself as dishonest, but she carried shame about these compromises with absolute honesty. The politician's blatant dishonesty was like a funhouse mirror, reflecting back to her own discomfort with truthfulness in an exaggerated form. Her rage at his lies was actually rage at her own compromises with integrity. Her contempt for his lack of authenticity was contempt for her own performance of an idealized self. This recognition didn't make the politician's behavior acceptable or appropriate. It didn't eliminate Sarah's concerns about political corruption or the importance of ethical leadership, but it did dramatically reduce the emotional charge she carried about it. She could now respond to political issues from a place of conscious values rather than unconscious projection. This is how projection works in intimate relationships as well. The qualities that first attract us to romantic partners are often projections of our own unlived potential. We fall in love with our own disowned creativity in the artistic partner, our own unexpressed adventure-seeking in the spontaneous partner, our own buried sensitivity in the emotionally expressive partner. But as relationships deepen and the initial projection begins to fade, we often become critical of these same qualities. The creativity we once found inspiring now seems impractical. The spontaneity we once loved now feels irresponsible. The emotional expressiveness we once admired now seems overwhelming. We're not really rejecting our partner. We're rejecting aspects of ourselves that felt safe to love when they were projected outward but threatening to own directly. Breaking free from projection requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold conscious tension between opposites without immediately resolving that tension through judgment or action. Instead of automatically assuming that our intense reactions to others are objective assessments of their character, we can learn to ask, what does this reaction reveal about me? This doesn't mean becoming paralyzed by self-doubt or abandoning all moral discernment. It means developing the capacity to distinguish between appropriate response to actual behavior and unconscious reaction to projected material. It means learning to take back our projections and own the disowned aspects of ourselves that we've been fighting in others. When you can recognize your judgments as information about your own internal state, rather than definitive statements about external reality, several things happen. First, you become less reactive and more responsive. You can address actual problems without the emotional charge that comes from projection. Second, you become more compassionate, both toward yourself and others, because you recognize the common humanity in struggles you once thought were unique to other people. Most importantly, you begin to reclaim your power. Projection gives others tremendous unconscious control over your emotional state. When you're projecting, other people's behavior can instantly trigger your rage, your contempt, your despair. But when you own your projections, when you take back what belongs to you, you become free to choose your responses rather than being compelled by unconscious reactions. The people who most trigger your judgment are actually your greatest teachers, offering you precise information about what within yourself most needs attention, acceptance, and integration. They're not your enemies, they're your mirrors, and in learning to see clearly in these mirrors, you learn to see yourself with the clarity and compassion that makes wholeness possible. There is a part of you that has been watching this entire conversation unfold. It's the part that has been aware of your reactions to these words, that has noticed your agreement or resistance, that has observed the thoughts and feelings arising as you've contemplated the nature of projection and emotional reactivity. This witnessing presence has been with you always, but it's often obscured by the drama of thinking, feeling, and reacting. This is what mystics and psychologists alike call the observer self, the aspect of consciousness that can watch your mental and emotional processes without being completely identified with them. It's not separate from your thoughts and feelings, but it's not limited to them either. It's the space in which all your experiences arise and pass away, the aware presence that gives context and perspective to the constant stream of psychological phenomena. Discovering the observer self is like realizing you've been watching a movie and mistaking yourself for the main character. You've been so absorbed in the drama unfolding on the screen, the conflicts, the emotions, the story of your life, that you forgot you were actually sitting safely in the theater, with the capacity to step back and see the whole production from a broader perspective. This realization is profoundly liberating because it reveals that you are not your thoughts, you are not your emotions, and you are not your reactions. You are the consciousness that experiences all of these phenomena. And from this perspective, even the most challenging emotions become workable, because they're no longer overwhelming your entire sense of self. When someone triggers your anger, for instance, instead of becoming the anger, instead of having your entire identity temporarily consumed by rage, you can learn to experience the anger while maintaining connection to the observer that watches the anger arise. This creates what psychologists call emotional regulation and what contemplatives call equanimity, the capacity to remain centered and responsive even in the midst of strong emotional states. The development of the observer self is not about becoming cold or detached. It's not about suppressing emotions or pretending they don't matter. It's about creating enough internal space so that you can feel your feelings fully without being overwhelmed by them, so that you can think your thoughts without being tyrannized by them, so that you can experience your reactions without being compelled to act on them automatically. Consider Marcus, a software engineer who struggled with intense anxiety in social situations. Whenever he had to speak in meetings or attend networking events, his nervous system would flood with stress hormones. His heart would race, his palms would sweat, his mind would go blank. He would become so identified with the anxiety that it felt like his entire reality in those moments. Through meditation and therapy, Marcus began to cultivate his observer self. He learned to notice when anxiety was arising without immediately becoming consumed by it. He could feel his heart racing while simultaneously maintaining awareness that he was more than just his racing heart. He could notice his thoughts spiraling toward catastrophe, while remembering that thoughts are just mental events, not necessarily accurate predictions of reality. This shift didn't eliminate Marcus's anxiety entirely, but it transformed his relationship to it. Instead of anxiety being something that happened to him and overwhelmed him, it became something he could observe and work with skillfully. He could feel anxious while still choosing to speak up in meetings. He could notice social anxiety while still deciding to attend networking events. The anxiety was no longer controlling his behavior because he was no longer completely identified with it. The observer self provides what Buddhist psychology calls wise view, the capacity to see experiences as they actually are, rather than as filtered through the distortions of ego, projection, and emotional reactivity. From the observer's perspective, you can recognize that your intense anger at your colleague's arrogance might be showing you something about your own relationship with confidence. You can notice that your judgment of your neighbor's lifestyle choices might be revealing your own internal conflicts about freedom and responsibility. This witnessing awareness doesn't require years of meditation or therapy to access, though contemplative practices certainly help develop it. You can begin to cultivate the observer self right now by simply noticing that you're noticing. When you're angry, you can observe, I'm having angry thoughts. I'm feeling angry sensations in my body. When you're judging someone, you can notice, I'm having judgmental thoughts about this person. The key is the subtle but profound shift from, I am angry, to, I am experiencing anger. From, I am judgmental, to, I am having judgmental thoughts. This linguistic difference reflects a fundamental shift in identity, from being your emotions and thoughts to being the awareness that experiences emotions and thoughts. Dr. Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist and researcher, Jung uses the phrase, "name it to tame it," to describe how simply observing and labeling emotional states can reduce their intensity and increase your capacity to respond rather than react. When you can step into the observer self and say, "I notice I'm having a strong reaction to this person's behavior," you've already created some space between yourself and the reaction. The observer self also provides access to what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension between opposing forces without immediately resolving that tension through unconscious action. From the observer's perspective, you can hold both your anger at someone's behavior and your awareness that your reaction might be revealing something important about yourself. You can experience both your judgment of another person and your curiosity about what that judgment might be showing you about your own shadow. This capacity to hold opposites without immediately collapsing into one side or the other is essential for psychological maturation and spiritual development. It allows you to remain open to multiple perspectives, to sit with uncertainty and complexity, to respond rather than react to challenging situations. Perhaps most importantly, the observer self provides access to choice. When you're completely identified with your emotions and reactions, you feel compelled to act on them. The anger demands expression, the judgment demands validation, the fear demands avoidance. But from the observer's perspective, emotions and thoughts are simply information, important information that deserves attention, but not commands that must be obeyed. You can observe your anger and choose how to respond to it skillfully. You can notice your judgments and decide whether they're worth expressing or investigating. You can feel your fear and still choose courage. The observer self is the space of freedom within which conscious choice becomes possible. This is not about becoming perfect or eliminating all reactive patterns. The observer self doesn't make you immune to triggers or free from emotional challenges, but it does provide a stable foundation from which you can work with whatever arises in your experience with greater wisdom, compassion, and skill. When you know yourself as the awareness that witnesses all experiences rather than the experiences themselves, you begin to taste a freedom that no external circumstance can destroy. You remain centered in yourself, even when others are difficult. You maintain your peace even in the midst of conflict. You respond from wisdom even when emotions are intense. The observer self has been with you all along, quietly witnessing every moment of your life. It's simply a matter of remembering what you've always been, underneath all the drama of thoughts, emotions, and reactions. It's the space of awareness in which all of life unfolds, the theater in which the movie of your existence plays out, the sky in which all weather patterns arise and pass away. Between the trigger and the reaction lies an infinite universe of possibility. In that microsecond gap, briefer than a heartbeat, subtler than a breath, the entire trajectory of your response to any challenging situation can be transformed. Most people never notice this gap exists. They experience trigger and reaction as one seamless, automatic process. Someone does something irritating, and instantly they're flooded with anger, judgment, or defensive responses. But hidden within that instantaneous process is a pause that can change everything. This pause is not something you have to create. It's already there, waiting to be noticed and expanded. It's the space between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl wrote about when he said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Learning to find and inhabit this pause is perhaps the most practical and transformative skill you can develop for managing emotional reactivity and breaking free from unconscious patterns. It's the difference between being controlled by your triggers and being able to work with them consciously. It's the difference between reacting from old wounds and responding from present moment awareness. The pause begins with breath. When you feel that familiar surge of irritation, anger, or judgment beginning to rise, the first intervention is simply to breathe. Not a special breathing technique, not a complicated meditation practice, just one conscious breath that interrupts the automatic cascade from trigger to reaction. Watch what happens when you do this. As you take that breath, you might notice that the emotional charge doesn't disappear, but it also doesn't have to immediately translate into words or actions. You create a small space of awareness around the reaction. In that space, you can begin to observe what's actually happening, rather than simply being swept along by it. Consider Elena, a manager who found herself constantly frustrated by one of her team members, Kevin. Kevin had a habit of asking what Elena considered to be obvious questions in team meetings. Every time he spoke up, Elena would feel her jaw clench, and her internal critic would start generating harsh judgments. Why doesn't he think before he speaks? He's wasting everyone's time. He must not be paying attention. For months, Elena would respond to Kevin's questions with barely concealed impatience, giving curt answers and sometimes making sarcastic comments that she could see hurt and confused him. She knew her responses were unprofessional, but in the moment, she felt compelled by her irritation. Then Elena learned about the pause. The next time Kevin asked what she considered an obvious question, instead of immediately responding with frustration, she took one conscious breath. In that breath, she noticed several things: the tightening in her chest, the judgmental thoughts arising in her mind, and surprisingly, a flash of memory from her own early career when she had been afraid to ask questions for fear of appearing incompetent. That breath created just enough space for Elena to remember that Kevin was relatively new to the team, that his questions, while basic to her, might be genuine attempts to understand and contribute. She could respond to his actual question rather than to her projected interpretation of his motives. This is the power of the pause. It creates space for awareness to emerge. In that awareness, you can begin to see the difference between what's actually happening and the story your mind is telling about what's happening. You can distinguish between the present moment and the echoes of past experiences that your nervous system might be responding to. The pause also allows you to access what Daniel Goleman calls emotional intelligence, the capacity to recognize emotions as they're arising and respond to them skillfully rather than being overwhelmed by them. When you can pause long enough to name what you're feeling, you've already begun to regulate that emotion. I notice I'm feeling angry. I'm aware that judgment is arising. I can feel my nervous system activating. This kind of mindful awareness doesn't suppress the emotion, but it prevents the emotion from completely taking over your cognitive functions and behavioral choices. In the pause, you can also begin to investigate the roots of your reaction. This reminds me of, I've felt this way before when. This touches on my sensitivity about. Often, our strongest reactions in the present are amplified by unresolved experiences from the past. The pause gives you access to this deeper layer of understanding. But perhaps most importantly, the pause gives you access to choice. When you're caught in automatic reaction, you feel like you have no options. You must express your anger. You must defend yourself. You must prove the other person wrong. But in the pause, you can ask yourself, how do I want to respond? What response would be most aligned with my values? What response would be most likely to create the outcome I actually want? This doesn't mean you always have to be perfectly controlled or never express strong emotions. Sometimes the most authentic and appropriate response is to express anger or set a firm boundary. The difference is that you're choosing to express anger rather than being compelled by it. You're setting boundaries from conscious intention rather than unconscious reactivity. The pause can be cultivated through practice. Every time you remember to take that conscious breath before responding to a trigger, you're strengthening your capacity to inhabit the space between stimulus and response. Every time you catch yourself in automatic reaction and simply notice it without judgment, you're developing the observer awareness that makes the pause possible. Over time, this practice begins to change your entire relationship to challenging situations and difficult people. Instead of experiencing them as threats to your peace, you begin to experience them as opportunities to practice consciousness, compassion, and skillful response. Instead of being victims of your reactions, you become students of your own consciousness. The pause that changes everything is always available. It doesn't require special circumstances or perfect conditions. It's there in the middle of arguments with your partner, in moments of frustration with your children, in encounters with difficult colleagues, in reactions to news that troubles you, in responses to behavior that triggers your judgment. It's there right now, in this moment, as you consider these words. Can you feel it? That space of awareness in which you can observe your thoughts about what you're reading. Notice your reactions to these ideas. Feel your breath moving in and out of your body. This is the pause, expanded into a moment of conscious presence. From this pause, this space of awareness, this moment of choice, everything becomes workable. Every trigger becomes a teacher. Every reaction becomes information. Every challenging person becomes an opportunity to practice love in action. The pause doesn't solve all problems or eliminate all conflict, but it transforms you from someone who is controlled by circumstances into someone who can respond to circumstances with wisdom, compassion, and skill. In the pause, you remember who you really are, not the reactive patterns of your personality, not the wounded child of your past, not the defensive ego of your fears, but the aware, loving, infinitely creative consciousness that has been watching it all unfold. The pause is the doorway back to yourself, always open, always available, always ready to transform conflict into consciousness. In the depths of every human psyche lives a creature that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid meeting. It dwells in the underground chambers of consciousness, beyond the reach of the carefully constructed identity you present to the world. This creature has been feeding on everything you've rejected about yourself, every impulse you've labeled as unacceptable, every emotion you've deemed inappropriate, every desire you've judged as wrong. The ancient myths knew this creature well. They called it the dragon in the cave, the monster at the threshold, the shadow guardian that must be faced before any treasure can be claimed. In Greek mythology, heroes had to descend into the underworld and confront their greatest fears. In fairy tales, the protagonist must face the witch, the giant, the terrible beast that guards the path to transformation. But here's what the myths understood that modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover: the monster is not your enemy. The monster is you, the disowned, rejected, exiled parts of yourself that have been growing in the darkness, waiting for the day when you would be brave enough to turn toward them with something other than fear or disgust. Carl Jung called this confrontation with the shadow one of the most crucial tasks of human development. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Meeting your monster is disagreeable. It requires you to acknowledge that you are capable of the very things you most condemn in others. It demands that you face your capacity for selfishness, cruelty, dishonesty, manipulation, all the qualities you've worked so hard to prove you don't possess. It asks you to recognize that the person you've been fighting in others has been living inside you all along. Consider the moment when David, a man who prided himself on his integrity and honesty, began to realize that his obsessive criticism of his brother's lies was connected to his own relationship with truth. For years, David had watched his brother make excuses, bend facts, and present himself in unrealistically positive ways. David's anger at these behaviors was intense and persistent. He would spend hours analyzing his brother's deceptions, building elaborate cases for his brother's moral bankruptcy. But in therapy, David began to explore his own history with honesty. He remembered the small deceptions of childhood, the lies told to avoid punishment, the stories embellished to gain attention, the truths withheld to protect himself. He began to notice his current tendencies to present himself in the best possible light, to minimize his mistakes in conversations, to exaggerate his successes on social media. The realization that he contained the same capacity for dishonesty that he so harshly judged in his brother was initially devastating. David's entire self-concept was built around being the honest one in the family, the person with integrity, the one who could be trusted. Facing his own shadow around truth-telling felt like a death of identity. This is why meeting the monster is so terrifying. It threatens the very foundation of who you think you are. The ego has invested enormous energy in maintaining the illusion that you are fundamentally different from those you judge, that you are innocent of the qualities you condemn, that your anger and criticism are justified by your moral superiority. But here's the paradox that Jung discovered. The very qualities you most fiercely reject in yourself are often the ones that contain your greatest potential for wholeness and power. The monster is not just a repository of destructive impulses, it's also the guardian of your unlived life, your repressed creativity, your authentic power. David's confrontation with his own capacity for dishonesty led him to a deeper understanding of truth. He realized that his compulsive honesty was actually a form of rigidity that prevented him from accessing other important qualities, like tact, compassion, and appropriate boundaries. His shadow contained not just his capacity for deception, but also his ability to be flexible with truth in service of kindness, his skill at protecting others' feelings, and his wisdom about when full disclosure serves relationship and when it doesn't. The monster often appears most clearly in your projections. The people who trigger your most intense judgments are usually showing you aspects of your shadow that are ready to be integrated. Your fury at someone's arrogance might be pointing to your own disowned confidence. Your disgust at another's neediness might be revealing your own rejected vulnerability. Your rage at someone's selfishness might be showing you your own unacknowledged needs for care and attention. But meeting the monster requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires what Jung called feeling realization, the emotional experience of recognizing yourself in what you've been rejecting. This recognition often comes with intense shame, grief, or fear. You might feel like you're falling apart, like everything you believed about yourself was a lie, like you can't trust your own perceptions or judgments. This dissolution is actually necessary. The false self that was built on rejecting parts of your humanity must die before the authentic self can be born. The ego's carefully constructed fortress of identity must crumble before the psyche can reorganize itself around truth rather than fantasy. In mythological terms, this is the hero's descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the death that precedes rebirth. It's the moment when all the old certainties fall away and you're left face to face with the raw reality of your complex, contradictory, magnificently human nature. The key to surviving this encounter is compassion. The monster has been created by your own rejection of yourself. It has been fed by years of shame, judgment, and exile. It doesn't need more condemnation. It needs understanding. It doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be welcomed home. This is perhaps the most radical aspect of Jung's approach to the shadow. He didn't advocate trying to eliminate or transcend the dark aspects of human nature. He advocated integrating them, finding ways to honor their energy while channeling it constructively rather than destructively. When you can meet your monster with curiosity rather than judgment, when you can extend compassion to the parts of yourself you've been ashamed of, when you can welcome home the exiled aspects of your personality, something miraculous happens. The energy that was locked up in maintaining these internal splits becomes available for creativity, authenticity, and wholeness. The monster transforms from enemy to ally. The shadow qualities that once operated unconsciously and destructively become conscious resources that you can access appropriately. Your capacity for anger becomes a tool for healthy boundary setting. Your selfishness becomes healthy self-care. Your manipulative tendencies become skillful social navigation. Meeting the monster is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of recognition, acceptance, and integration. Each time you catch yourself in harsh judgment of another person, you have an opportunity to ask, what is this person showing me about myself? Each time you feel triggered by someone's behavior, you can explore, how do I express this same quality in my own life? The monster is waiting for you to turn toward it with courage and compassion. It's been calling to you through every person who has ever triggered your rage, every behavior that has activated your judgment, every quality that has stirred your disgust. It's not trying to destroy you, it's trying to complete you. The treasure guarded by the monster is nothing less than your own wholeness. Beyond the fear of meeting what you've rejected lies the possibility of becoming fully human, not perfect, but complete. Not good, but whole. Not pure, but authentic. The monster has been your teacher all along, disguised as your enemy. It's time to turn toward it and discover what it has been trying to teach you about the magnificent complexity of being human. Deep in the underground chambers of the ancient alchemists' laboratories, a mysterious process was said to transform base metals into gold. The alchemists called it the opus magnum, the great work. They spoke in symbols and metaphors, describing the death and rebirth of matter, the marriage of opposites, the emergence of something precious from what appeared worthless or even toxic. But the medieval alchemists were not just working with metals and chemical reactions. They were mapping an internal process, describing the psychological transformation that occurs when consciousness learns to work with its own darkness. What they called the transmutation of lead into gold was actually the transformation of unconscious suffering into conscious wisdom, of reactive patterns into responsive awareness, of shadow into light. This alchemical transformation is what happens when you learn to work with your anger, your judgments, and your emotional reactivity as raw material for your own evolution rather than as evidence of your inadequacy or others' wrongness. The very emotions that once seemed like obstacles to peace become the fuel for a deeper understanding of yourself and a more authentic way of being in the world. The first stage of this transformation is what the alchemists called nigredo, the blackening, the dark night of the soul, the confrontation with everything you've been trying to avoid about yourself. This is the stage you've just passed through in meeting your monster, in facing the reality that you contain the very qualities you most harshly judge in others. But nigredo is not the end of the process. It's the beginning. In the darkness of this recognition, something begins to stir. The rigid structures of the ego start to soften. The defensive walls that have kept your shadow locked away begin to develop cracks. Light starts to seep into places that have been dark for years, maybe decades. This is the stage the alchemists called albedo, the whitening, the emergence of clarity from confusion, the birth of awareness from unconsciousness. It's the moment when you begin to see that your emotional reactions are not random events happening to you, but precise information about your internal state. It's when you realize that every person who triggers you is actually offering you a gift, the opportunity to reclaim another piece of your projected self. Sarah discovered this transformation when she began working with her intense anger toward her colleague Marcus, whose aggressive communication style had been triggering her for months. Initially, her anger felt completely justified. Marcus was inappropriate, domineering, insensitive to others' needs. But as Sarah learned to pause before reacting, to breathe into her responses, to become curious about her internal experience rather than immediately focusing on changing Marcus's behavior, something unexpected began to happen. She started to notice that her anger contained information. It was telling her that she felt powerless, that her own voice was being suppressed, that she had needs and boundaries that weren't being respected. But more surprisingly, she began to recognize that Marcus was reflecting back to her own disowned capacity for assertiveness, directness, and taking up space unapologetically. As a woman in a professional environment, Sarah had learned to moderate her voice, to soften her opinions, to make herself smaller to be acceptable. She had rejected her own capacity for direct communication, for bold self-expression, for claiming her rightful place in conversations and decisions. Marcus's behavior was triggering her, because it was showing her exactly what she had been afraid to embody. This recognition marked the beginning of Sarah's alchemical transformation. Instead of seeing her anger as evidence that Marcus needed to change, she began to see it as information about what needed to change within herself. Instead of trying to suppress or justify her emotional reactions, she began to investigate what they were trying to teach her. The anger began to transform. Where once there had been reactive rage, there began to emerge what the ancient traditions called righteous anger, the clean energy of knowing her own worth and refusing to accept treatment that violated her dignity. Where once there had been judgment and blame, there began to develop compassion for both Marcus's unconscious behavior and her own reactive patterns. This is the heart of the alchemical process, the recognition that every emotion, even the most seemingly destructive ones, contains within it the seeds of wisdom and wholeness. Anger, when met with consciousness rather than reactivity, reveals your boundaries, your values, your capacity for self-protection. Jealousy, when explored rather than suppressed, shows you what you most desire for yourself. Fear, when approached with curiosity rather than avoidance, points to what matters most to you. The alchemists understood that transformation doesn't happen by eliminating the darkness, but by bringing consciousness to it. They didn't try to skip the difficult stages of the process, but learned to work skillfully with each phase, extracting the essence of wisdom from every experience. In your own alchemical process, this means learning to see every trigger as a teacher, every difficult person as a mirror, every emotional reaction as raw material for greater self-understanding. It means developing the capacity to hold both your anger and your awareness of what that anger might be revealing about your own unconscious material. The third stage of the alchemical process is rubedo, the reddening, the emergence of the philosopher's stone, the completion of the great work. In psychological terms, this is the integration of shadow and light, the marriage of conscious and unconscious, the birth of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites without being torn apart by them. When Sarah reached this stage in her own process, she discovered that she could feel triggered by Marcus's behavior while simultaneously maintaining awareness of what that trigger was teaching her. She could experience anger while also accessing compassion. She could set boundaries with firmness while also maintaining respect for his humanity. She had learned to work with her emotional reactivity as information rather than being controlled by it as compulsion. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The alchemical process takes time, patience, and repeated application. Each time Sarah caught herself in reactive judgment, each time she remembered to pause and investigate her internal experience, each time she chose response over reaction, she was adding another element to her alchemical laboratory. But gradually, the base metal of unconscious reactivity began to transform into the gold of conscious response. Her relationships became more authentic because she was no longer projecting her shadow onto others. Her communication became more effective because she was expressing her actual needs rather than reactive complaints. Her peace became more stable because it was no longer dependent on others behaving according to her preferences. The light that emerges from this alchemical process is not the artificial brightness of spiritual bypassing or positive thinking. It's the natural radiance that appears when consciousness learns to work skillfully with all aspects of human experience, light and dark, pleasant and difficult, acceptable and rejected. This light illuminates not just your own psyche, but your relationships with others. When you're no longer unconsciously fighting your own shadow through projection onto others, you can see them more clearly. When you're no longer using other people's behavior as evidence for your judgments about human nature, you can respond to them as fellow travelers on the path of becoming conscious. The alchemical transformation of anger into wisdom, of reactivity into responsiveness, of shadow into light, is perhaps the most practical spiritual work you can undertake. It doesn't require retreating from the world or waiting for perfect conditions. It simply requires learning to work consciously with whatever life presents, using every challenge as an opportunity to extract the gold of awareness from the lead of unconscious reaction. In the depths of your most difficult emotions lies light waiting to be discovered. In the heart of your most challenging relationships lies wisdom waiting to be extracted. In the center of your most triggering experiences lies the raw material for your own transformation, from unconscious reaction to conscious response, from fragmented self to integrated wholeness. There is a forgiveness that the world knows little about, a forgiveness that has nothing to do with condoning harmful behavior or pretending that wrong actions are acceptable. This forgiveness doesn't require that others change, apologize, or even acknowledge their impact. It doesn't depend on justice being served or wrongs being righted. It is the forgiveness that sets you free, whether or not anyone else ever changes at all. This forgiveness emerges from a profound recognition. You do not forgive others. You forgive the part of you that blamed them for your internal suffering. You forgive the part of you that gave them the power to determine your peace. You forgive the part of you that made your wholeness dependent on their behavior. This understanding turns the entire concept of forgiveness on its head. Instead of forgiveness being something you graciously bestow upon others, it becomes something you give to yourself, the gift of freedom from the prison of resentment, the liberation from the exhausting work of maintaining grievances, the release from the illusion that others control your inner state. Consider Maria. who spent 15 years carrying rage toward her father for his emotional unavailability during her childhood. She had built an elaborate case against him, collecting evidence of his failures, rehearsing arguments about how his behavior had damaged her capacity for trust and intimacy. She felt justified in her anger. After all, he had been neglectful. He had failed to provide the emotional support she needed. He had caused real harm to her developing psyche. But Maria's anger, however justified, was keeping her trapped in the very patterns she blamed him for creating. Her resentment toward his emotional withdrawal had caused her to withdraw emotionally from her own relationships. Her fury at his inability to be present with her feelings had made her unable to be present with others' emotions. Her rage at his selfishness had made her hypersensitive to any sign of self-centeredness in others, creating conflict in every relationship. Maria's anger wasn't protecting her from becoming like her father. It was ensuring that she would perpetuate his patterns in different forms. Her resentment wasn't holding him accountable for his behavior. It was holding her hostage to behaviors that were decades in the past. Her blame wasn't creating the emotional safety she had missed as a child. It was recreating the same emotional unavailability she had experienced. The forgiveness that freed Maria didn't begin with thinking kind thoughts about her father or excusing his parenting failures. It began with recognizing how her resentment was perpetuating her own suffering. It started with seeing how her blame was giving her father ongoing power over her emotional state 30 years after the original wounds occurred. This recognition is often initially disturbing because it challenges the ego's narrative about victimhood and perpetration, about who's responsible for what, about where healing must come from. The ego wants to maintain clear categories. They are wrong, you are right. They must change, then you can heal. They caused the problem, so they must solve it. But this binary thinking keeps you trapped in reactivity and dependence. As long as your peace depends on others acknowledging their wrongs, apologizing for their behavior, or making amends for past harm, you remain at the mercy of people who may never provide what you're seeking. You give them ongoing control over your emotional freedom. The forgiveness that transforms everything begins with taking back this power. It starts with recognizing that your resentment, however justified its origins, is now your responsibility. Others may have planted seeds of pain in your psyche, but you are the one who has been watering them with your ongoing anger, feeding them with your repeated rehearsal of grievances, keeping them alive with your investment in being right about how wrong they were. This doesn't mean minimizing the reality of harm that was done or the impact it had on your life. It means recognizing that holding on to resentment is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. It means understanding that your continued anger is punishing you far more than it's affecting them. James discovered this when he began working with his rage toward his ex-wife, who had left him for another man and taken their children across the country. For 5 years, James had been consumed with anger about her betrayal, her selfishness, her destruction of their family. He felt completely justified in his fury. She had violated their marriage vows, broken apart their home, and limited his access to his children. But James's justified anger was destroying his life. He couldn't maintain new relationships because he was constantly comparing them to his failed marriage. He couldn't be fully present with his children during visits because he was preoccupied with his resentment toward their mother. He couldn't move forward with his life because he was emotionally still fighting a war that had ended years ago. The forgiveness that freed James didn't require him to approve of his ex-wife's choices or pretend that her actions hadn't caused real harm. It required him to see how his ongoing resentment was now causing more damage to his life than her original betrayal had. It meant recognizing that his anger, while initially a natural response to being hurt, had become a prison he was keeping himself in. This shift from blaming others for your pain to taking responsibility for your response to pain is perhaps the most mature and empowering step human beings can take. It doesn't mean others weren't wrong or that their actions didn't cause harm. It means recognizing that your continued suffering is now a choice you're making rather than a sentence they imposed on you. The forgiveness of the mirror is radical because it reveals that the people you resent most are often showing you aspects of yourself that you haven't yet learned to forgive. The father whose emotional unavailability you blame for your relationship difficulties might be reflecting your own capacity for withdrawal when emotions become intense. The ex-spouse whose selfishness you condemn might be mirroring your own struggles with balancing self-care and care for others. This recognition can initially feel like victim blaming, but it's actually victim freeing. When you can see how others' behaviors are reflecting aspects of your own shadow, you stop being the helpless victim of their actions and become the empowered agent of your own healing. You move from waiting for them to change, so you can be happy to recognizing that your happiness was never actually dependent on their behavior. The mirror of difficult relationships shows you exactly where your own healing work needs to happen. The person whose anger triggers your fear is showing you your own relationship with anger. The individual whose neediness irritates you is reflecting your own discomfort with vulnerability. The colleague whose arrogance infuriates you is mirroring your own complex relationship with confidence and self-worth. When you can forgive the mirror, when you can release your resentment toward those who have reflected your shadow back to you, you free yourself from the unconscious compulsion to keep recreating the same patterns in relationship after relationship. You stop attracting the same types of difficult people because you're no longer unconsciously seeking opportunities to fight the same internal battles through external conflicts. Forgiving the mirror is ultimately an act of self-compassion. It's recognizing that you've been doing the best you could with the level of consciousness you had available at the time. It's acknowledging that everyone is struggling with their own unconscious patterns, their own unhealed wounds, their own attempts to find peace and wholeness in a complex world. This forgiveness doesn't condone harmful behavior or eliminate the need for boundaries and accountability, but it frees you from the exhausting work of maintaining resentments and opens up space for authentic response rather than reactive patterns. It allows you to engage with difficult people from a place of strength rather than triggered reactivity. When you forgive the mirror, you discover that the face you've been fighting in others has been your own face all along. And in recognizing this, you find the compassion that makes true healing possible. There is a strength that the world mistakes for weakness, a power that appears as gentleness, a force that manifests as compassion. This strength doesn't assert itself through domination or aggression. It doesn't prove its worth through conquest or control. It emerges from the deepest recognition of what it means to be fully human, complete with all the light and shadow, beauty and brokenness, wisdom and foolishness that human existence contains. This is the strength of integration, the power that comes from making peace with the totality of your nature rather than trying to maintain an idealized image of yourself. It's the strength that Jung discovered in his own journey toward what he called individuation, not the process of becoming good, but the process of becoming whole. Most people spend their lives trying to be good according to some external standard. Their family's expectations, their culture's values, their religious teachings, their society's definitions of success and morality. They construct elaborate personas, carefully curated presentations of themselves that display only the qualities deemed acceptable and hide everything that might be judged as inappropriate or wrong. But this pursuit of goodness, while often well-intentioned, creates a fundamental split within the psyche. It requires rejecting aspects of human nature that are natural and inevitable. It demands maintaining an impossible standard of perfection that leaves no room for the messy reality of being human. It creates what Jung called the problem of the opposites, the exhausting internal war between who you think you should be and who you actually are. The strength of compassion emerges from ending this war. It comes from recognizing that you are not meant to be a perfect being but a complete one. You're not supposed to eliminate your capacity for selfishness, anger, jealousy, or fear. You're meant to integrate these qualities into a conscious whole where they can serve wholeness rather than creating unconscious destruction. Consider the difference between someone who has suppressed their anger and someone who has integrated it. The person who has suppressed anger often appears calm and peaceful on the surface, but this peace is brittle. It depends on others not triggering their repressed rage. When their anger is activated, it erupts unconsciously, in passive-aggressive behavior, in sudden explosions of rage, in projected judgments onto others who express anger more directly. The person who has integrated their anger, by contrast, has made peace with this aspect of their nature. They can feel angry without being consumed by anger. They can express their boundaries and displeasure directly and appropriately, rather than through unconscious leakage. Their calm doesn't depend on others being perfect. It comes from their capacity to work skillfully with whatever emotions arise. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "I'd rather be whole than good." He understood that the pursuit of goodness often requires splitting off essential aspects of human nature. While the pursuit of wholeness includes everything in conscious relationship, the integrated person doesn't try to eliminate their dark impulses, but learns to work with them consciously and constructively. Sarah's journey illustrates this transformation. For years, she had prided herself on being the nice person in her family and friend groups. She never expressed anger directly, never set boundaries that might upset others, never said no to requests even when she was overwhelmed. She thought this made her a good, loving, spiritual person. But Sarah's niceness was actually a form of unconscious manipulation, a strategy to avoid conflict and ensure others' approval. Her suppressed anger leaked out in subtle ways. The slight edge in her voice when she felt taken advantage of, the resentful thoughts about others, selfishness, the martyrdom that made others feel guilty for having needs that inconvenienced her. When Sarah began to integrate her shadow, she discovered that her capacity for anger was actually connected to her capacity for love. Her anger was her psyche's way of protecting what she valued, of signaling when her boundaries were being violated, of energizing her to take action on behalf of herself and others. Learning to express anger appropriately didn't make her less loving, it made her love more authentic and sustainable. This integration of shadow qualities doesn't mean acting out every impulse or abandoning all moral standards. It means bringing unconscious aspects of yourself into conscious relationship where they can be expressed appropriately rather than destructively. Your selfishness becomes healthy self-care. Your jealousy becomes clarity about what you desire for yourself. Your manipulation becomes skillful social navigation. Your anger becomes boundary setting and protection of what matters to you. The compassion that emerges from this integration is fundamentally different from the niceness that comes from suppressing difficult aspects of yourself. Nice people are often conditional in their acceptance. They can be kind to others as long as others behave in ways that don't trigger their own suppressed shadow material. But truly compassionate people have made peace with the full spectrum of human nature, both in themselves and others. This allows them to remain centered and responsive even when others are being difficult, because they're not unconsciously fighting their own capacity for difficulty through projection onto others. They can maintain boundaries without hatred, express disapproval without contempt, protect themselves without demonizing those they're protecting themselves from. Marcus learned this lesson through his relationship with his teenage son, Tyler, whose rebellious behavior had been triggering Marcus's rage for months. Marcus had grown up in a family where respect for authority was paramount, where questioning parents was seen as a serious transgression. Tyler's challenges to Marcus's rules and decisions felt like personal attacks on his authority and worth as a father. Initially, Marcus responded to Tyler's rebellion with increasing attempts at control, stricter rules, harsher punishments, demands for compliance and respect. But these strategies only escalated the conflict and drove Tyler further away. Marcus felt like he was failing as a father, and his shame about this failure made him even more reactive and controlling. The transformation came when Marcus began to recognize that Tyler's rebellious behavior was actually reflecting his own disowned capacity for independence, self-assertion, and questioning of authority. Marcus realized that his own rebellious impulses had been so thoroughly suppressed in childhood that he couldn't tolerate them in his son. As Marcus began to integrate his own capacity for healthy rebellion, his ability to question rules that didn't serve, to assert his own opinions, to stand up for his values, even when they conflicted with others' expectations, his relationship with Tyler began to transform. He could now see Tyler's behavior not as a personal attack, but as a natural and healthy assertion of independence. This didn't mean Marcus abandoned all boundaries or allowed Tyler to do whatever he wanted. But he could now set limits from a place of care rather than control, from wisdom rather than wounded authority. He could remain calm during Tyler's emotional storms because he wasn't unconsciously fighting his own rebellious nature through his son's behavior. The strength of integration is the strength to remain yourself in all circumstances. It's the power to respond rather than react, to stay centered in your values even when others are trying to pull you into their drama, to maintain your peace even when the world around you is chaotic. This strength doesn't come from perfecting yourself or eliminating all difficult qualities. It comes from making peace with your humanity, from accepting the full spectrum of your nature, from learning to work consciously with whatever arises in your experience. When you no longer need others to be different than they are in order for you to be okay, you discover a strength that no external circumstance can shake. When you no longer need to be perfect to accept yourself, you find a peace that doesn't depend on controlling life's variables. When you can embrace your shadow as well as your light, you become truly whole, and from that wholeness flows a compassion that can transform not only your own life, but the lives of everyone you touch. In the ancient art of alchemy, there was said to be a final stage of the great work, a moment when all the previous processes of dissolution, purification, and integration culminated in the creation of the philosopher's stone. This legendary substance was said to have the power to transform any base metal into gold, to heal any disease, to grant immortality to whoever possessed it. But the medieval alchemists were not really seeking a physical stone. They were mapping an internal transformation, describing the psychological state that emerges when consciousness learns to work with all aspects of experience as opportunities for awakening rather than obstacles to peace. The philosopher's stone was actually a metaphor for the alchemy of acceptance, the radical recognition that every experience, every emotion, every relationship difficulty contains within it the raw material for your own evolution. This is perhaps the most revolutionary understanding you can reach about the nature of human existence. Nothing in your life is happening to you. Everything is happening for you. Every person who triggers your judgment is offering you a precise map to your own unconscious material. Every situation activates your reactivity, is providing you with an opportunity to practice consciousness. Every emotion that feels uncomfortable is carrying information about what needs attention and integration within your psyche. The alchemy of acceptance doesn't mean becoming passive or resigned to harmful situations. It doesn't mean abandoning boundaries or standards or allowing others to treat you poorly. It means recognizing that your internal response to any external circumstance is entirely within your control and is always more important than trying to control the circumstance itself. When you truly understand this principle, every irritation becomes a teacher, every conflict becomes a classroom, every difficult person becomes a messenger from your unconscious, bringing you exactly the lesson you most need to learn. The person whose arrogance triggers your indignation is showing you where you need to develop healthy confidence. The individual whose neediness irritates you is pointing to your own disowned vulnerability. The colleague whose control issues frustrate you is reflecting your own relationship with power and surrender. Consider Elena's transformation through her difficult relationship with her mother-in-law, Carmen. For years, Elena experienced Carmen's visits as invasions, her suggestions as criticisms, her helpfulness as interference. Elena would spend weeks before and after Carmen's visits in a state of agitation, complaining to friends about Carmen's boundary violations, building elaborate cases for why Carmen's behavior was inappropriate and harmful. But through the practice of the alchemy of acceptance, Elena began to approach her relationship with Carmen as a spiritual practice. Instead of trying to change Carmen or avoid her, Elena began to use each interaction as an opportunity to observe her own reactive patterns, to practice staying centered in the face of triggering behavior, to develop her capacity for compassion in challenging circumstances. This shift didn't happen overnight. Initially, Elena could only maintain this perspective for minutes at a time before falling back into old patterns of resentment and resistance. But gradually, as she continued to practice seeing Carmen as a teacher rather than a tormentor, something remarkable began to happen. Elena started to recognize that Carmen's interference was actually reflecting her own fear of not being a good enough wife and mother. Carmen's suggestions triggered Elena, because they activated her own internal critic, her own doubts about her competence. Carmen's helpfulness felt like criticism because Elena was already criticizing herself for not having everything perfectly under control. As Elena began to work with her own internal critic rather than fighting Carmen's external suggestions, their relationship began to transform. Elena could now receive Carmen's input without immediately interpreting it as an attack on her adequacy. She could set boundaries when necessary, without the emotional charge that came from feeling constantly under siege. Most remarkably, Elena began to appreciate aspects of Carmen that she had previously found irritating. Carmen's confidence, which had once seemed like arrogance, Elena now recognized as a quality she wanted to develop in herself. Carmen's directness, which had felt like insensitivity, Elena began to see as refreshing honesty in a world where people often say what they think others want to hear rather than what they actually think. This is the magic of the alchemy of acceptance. When you stop fighting what is and start working with it consciously, the very things that once seemed like obstacles to your peace become the stepping stones to greater wisdom, compassion, and freedom. The people who most trigger your reactivity become your most valuable teachers. The situations that most challenge your equanimity become your most important opportunities for growth. The practice begins with a simple but profound shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin to ask, "How is this serving my evolution?" Instead of, "What's wrong with this person?" you ask, "What is this person teaching me about myself?" Instead of, "How can I change this situation?" you ask, "How can I respond to this situation in a way that serves my highest growth?" This doesn't mean you never take action to change circumstances, or that you passively accept harmful treatment. It means you make these decisions from a place of conscious choice rather than reactive compulsion. You can leave a job that no longer serves you without carrying resentment toward your employer. You can end a relationship that has become toxic without demonizing your partner. You can set boundaries with difficult people without needing them to be different than they are for you to be okay. The alchemy of acceptance reveals that your peace, your happiness, your sense of wholeness has never actually been dependent on external circumstances being a particular way. These qualities emerge from your relationship to whatever circumstances arise, from your capacity to find opportunity for growth and awakening in every situation life presents. When a colleague's behavior triggers your judgment, you can practice acceptance by asking, "How is this person serving my development? What aspect of myself is being reflected back to me? How can I use this trigger as an opportunity to practice consciousness rather than unconscious reactivity?" When a family member's choices activate your disapproval, you can transform the experience through acceptance. What does my reaction to their behavior reveal about my own internal conflicts? How can I love them while still honoring my own values? What would it look like to respond from wisdom rather than judgment? When a stranger's actions irritate you in traffic, at the store, or online, you can apply the alchemy of acceptance. This person is giving me a gift, the opportunity to practice patience, compassion, or simply remaining centered in the face of challenging behavior. How can I use this moment to strengthen my capacity for conscious response rather than reactive blame? This practice gradually transforms your entire relationship to life's difficulties. Instead of experiencing challenges as evidence that something is wrong with you, with others, or with the world, you begin to see them as perfectly designed opportunities for your own awakening. Instead of feeling victimized by difficult people and circumstances, you begin to feel curious about what they're here to teach you. The philosopher's stone of acceptance doesn't eliminate all problems or make life perfectly smooth. But it does provide you with the capacity to find gold in any situation, to extract wisdom from any experience, to maintain your center regardless of what chaos or difficulty arises around you. In the end, the alchemy of acceptance reveals the ultimate spiritual truth. Everything that happens in your life is in service of your awakening to your own wholeness. Every person you meet, every situation you encounter, every emotion you experience is perfectly designed to help you remember who you truly are, beneath all the roles, reactions, and identities you've constructed. The base metal of reactive suffering can indeed be transformed into the gold of conscious response. The philosopher's stone has been in your hands all along. The great work of transformation is always available, in this moment, with whatever life is presenting to you right now. Within every human being lives an ancient archetype that Jung recognized as one of the most powerful forces in the psyche, the warrior. But this is not the warrior of conquest and domination that popular culture celebrates. This is the sacred warrior, the one who has learned to wield the sword of consciousness in service of truth rather than ego, who fights not against external enemies but against the unconscious patterns that keep humanity trapped in cycles of reactivity and suffering. The calm warrior is what emerges when you have done the deep work of integrating your shadow, when you have made peace with the rejected aspects of yourself, when you have learned to see every trigger as a teacher rather than a threat. This warrior possesses a strength that cannot be shaken by external circumstances, a peace that doesn't depend on others behaving according to your preferences, a power that flows from wholeness rather than from the need to prove superiority over others. You can recognize the calm warrior in those rare individuals who remain centered in chaos, who respond rather than react to provocation, who maintain their values even when under pressure to abandon them. They are not passive or weak, they possess tremendous strength, but their strength is channeled toward protection and service rather than conquest and control. They fight for consciousness rather than against unconsciousness, for unity rather than against separation, for truth rather than against falsehood. The journey to becoming a calm warrior requires mastering what Jung called the tension between opposing archetypes within the psyche. Every person contains within them both the warrior and the sage, the capacity for action and the wisdom of reflection, the power to assert and the grace to surrender. Most people live in unconscious identification with one archetype or the other, either acting without wisdom or thinking without action. The calm warrior has learned to embody both simultaneously. Consider Marcus, a project manager who once found himself in constant conflict with his team members. Whenever someone questioned his decisions or failed to meet his standards, Marcus would respond with increasing aggression, raising his voice, making demands, threatening consequences. He thought this made him a strong leader, but it actually revealed his inner weakness. His need to control others through force showed how little control he had over his own emotional state. Marcus's transformation into a calm warrior began when he realized that his aggressive responses were actually coming from fear of being seen as incompetent, fear of losing control, fear of his projects failing. These fears were driving him to treat his team members as enemies to be conquered rather than allies to be supported. His warrior energy was being corrupted by unconscious shadow material. The turning point came during a particularly tense project meeting when a team member, Sarah, directly challenged one of Marcus's decisions in front of the entire group. Marcus felt the familiar surge of rage rising in his chest, the impulse to assert his authority through domination. But instead of immediately reacting, he took a breath and accessed the observer consciousness he had been developing. In that pause, Marcus recognized that Sarah's challenge was actually valuable feedback that could improve the project. Her willingness to speak up showed courage and commitment to the team's success. His anger was not about her behavior, it was about his own insecurity being triggered. He had a choice. He could react from his wounded ego or respond from his emerging wisdom. Marcus chose to respond as a calm warrior. He thanked Sarah for her input, acknowledged the validity of her concerns, and proposed that they explore alternative approaches together. The energy in the room immediately shifted from tension to collaboration. Marcus had discovered that real strength comes not from dominating others, but from mastering yourself. This is the essence of the calm warrior's power, the recognition that every external conflict is actually an opportunity to practice internal mastery. Every person who triggers your reactivity is offering you a chance to strengthen your capacity for conscious response. Every challenging situation is a training ground for developing unshakable peace. The calm warrior understands that the ultimate battlefield is consciousness itself. The real enemy is not other people's behavior, but your own unconscious patterns of reaction. The victory worth achieving is not the defeat of external opponents, but the integration of internal opposites. The peace worth winning is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of awareness in the midst of any conflict. But the calm warrior is incomplete without the sage, the archetype of wisdom, reflection, and deep understanding. The sage provides the perspective that prevents the warrior's strength from becoming mere aggression. The sage asks the questions that guide the warrior's actions. What is really needed here? What would serve the highest good? How can strength be applied with wisdom rather than reactivity? The marriage of warrior and sage creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox without being torn apart by it. The calm warrior can be fierce and gentle, simultaneously, strong and yielding, decisive and flexible. They can stand firm in their values while remaining open to new information. They can protect what needs protection while maintaining compassion for those they're protecting against. Elena embodied this integration in her relationship with her elderly mother, who had developed dementia and was becoming increasingly difficult to care for. Elena's mother would often become agitated, make unreasonable demands, and say hurtful things that seemed designed to wound. Elena's initial responses vacillated between aggressive attempts to control her mother's behavior and passive resignation to being abused. But as Elena developed her inner calm warrior, she learned to respond to her mother's difficult behavior with what she came to call fierce compassion. She could remain loving while setting necessary boundaries. She could protect her own well-being while caring for her mother's needs. She could stay present with her mother's pain without taking responsibility for fixing it or taking it personally. This required accessing both her warrior and sage energies simultaneously. The warrior provided the strength to endure difficult caregiving situations and the courage to make hard decisions about her mother's care. The sage provided the wisdom to see beyond her mother's difficult behavior to the frightened, confused person underneath, and the perspective to understand that her mother's hurtful words came from the disease rather than from deliberate malice. The calm warrior knows that true strength is measured not by your ability to control external circumstances, but by your capacity to remain centered regardless of what those circumstances present. They understand that peace is not the absence of conflict but the presence of consciousness in the midst of conflict. They recognize that real power comes not from making others conform to your will, but from aligning your will with wisdom and love. This transformation from reactive patterns to conscious response doesn't happen overnight. It requires daily practice, moment-by-moment choices to pause before reacting, consistent commitment to seeing triggers as teachers rather than threats. But gradually, through this practice, something remarkable emerges, an unshakable sense of self that doesn't depend on external validation or circumstances. The calm warrior has learned the ultimate secret of emotional mastery. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can always choose how you respond to what happens to you. This choice, made moment by moment, situation by situation, relationship by relationship, is the foundation of real freedom. It's the freedom to be yourself, regardless of who others are being, to maintain your peace regardless of how chaotic the world around you becomes, and to respond from love, regardless of how much fear or anger others are expressing. When the warrior and sage unite within you, when strength and wisdom flow together in conscious response to life's challenges, you become what Jung called individuated, not perfect, but whole, not without difficulties, but no longer controlled by them, not immune to triggers, but free to use them as opportunities for deeper understanding and more skillful response. The calm warrior stands at the center of the storm, unmoved by its fury, responding to whatever is needed with appropriate action arising from deep stillness. This is the goal of all inner work, not to eliminate life's challenges, but to meet them with the full presence of integrated consciousness. Not to become someone who never feels triggered, but to become someone who can use every trigger as a doorway to greater freedom. Freedom is not in controlling others, but in understanding yourself. This simple statement contains within it a revolution in thinking that can transform every relationship, every conflict, every moment of emotional reactivity from a source of suffering into an opportunity for liberation. Most people spend their lives trying to arrange external circumstances to match their internal preferences, attempting to control how others behave so they can feel okay inside. But true freedom moves in the opposite direction. It comes from developing such deep understanding of your own consciousness that you remain centered regardless of what anyone else chooses to do. The art of non-reaction is not about becoming emotionally numb or detached from life. It's not about suppressing your natural responses or pretending that other people's behavior doesn't affect you. It's about developing the capacity to feel everything fully, while not being controlled by what you feel. It's the ability to experience anger without becoming angry, to notice judgment without being judgmental, to feel triggered without being compelled to react automatically. This mastery emerges from a profound shift in identity. Instead of experiencing yourself as the victim of other people's behavior, you begin to recognize yourself as the conscious observer of your own responses. Instead of feeling at the mercy of external circumstances, you discover your power to choose how you'll work with whatever circumstances arise. Instead of needing others to be different so you can be happy, you learn to find your happiness in your own capacity for conscious response. Consider the transformation of David, a man who once lived at the mercy of his wife's moods. When she was happy, he was happy. When she was stressed or irritated, his entire nervous system would activate in response. He would spend enormous energy trying to manage her emotional state, tiptoeing around when she seemed tense, working overtime to cheer her up when she was sad, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering her anger. David thought he was being loving and supportive, but he was actually living in a state of constant reactivity. His peace depended entirely on his wife's emotional state, which meant he was never really at peace. His attempts to control her moods were subtle forms of manipulation, driven by his own need to feel okay rather than genuine care for her well-being. The shift began when David realized that his wife's emotions belonged to her, not to him. Her stress was information about her internal state, not a problem he needed to solve. Her irritability was her response to her own life circumstances, not evidence that he was failing as a husband. Her sadness was part of her human experience, not a crisis that required his immediate intervention. This recognition was initially difficult for David because it challenged his identity as a caring partner. He had confused taking responsibility for his wife's emotions with being loving. But he began to understand that truly loving someone means allowing them to have their own emotional experience without making it about you, supporting them without trying to control them, caring for them without sacrificing your own center. David started practicing what he came to call loving presence, the art of remaining centered and available while allowing his wife to have whatever emotional experience she was having. When she came home stressed from work, instead of immediately trying to fix her mood or taking her stress personally, he would simply listen, offer support when asked, and maintain his own equilibrium. This shift created a remarkable transformation in their relationship. When David stopped trying to manage his wife's emotions, she felt more freedom to experience and express them authentically. When he stopped taking her moods personally, she felt less pressure to perform emotional states for his comfort. When he maintained his own center regardless of her emotional state, she actually began to find his presence more calming and supportive. The art of non-reaction extends far beyond intimate relationships into every area of life. It's the capacity to remain centered when your boss is having a bad day, to stay present when your children are having meltdowns, to maintain your values when others are pressuring you to compromise them, to respond with wisdom when someone is trying to provoke you into conflict. Sarah discovered this principle in her relationship with her colleague James, whose habit of taking credit for her ideas had been a source of constant frustration. For months, Sarah would become consumed with anger whenever James presented her work as his own contribution. She would spend hours venting to friends, building elaborate cases for his unethical behavior, fantasizing about exposing his duplicity to their boss. But Sarah's anger, however justified, was giving James tremendous power over her emotional state. His behavior could instantly trigger her reactivity, flood her system with stress hormones, and consume her mental energy for hours or even days. She was, in effect, allowing James to control her internal experience through his actions. The transformation came when Sarah realized that James's behavior was revealing more about his own insecurity and lack of integrity than it was threatening her actual success or reputation. His need to steal credit was evidence of his own inadequacy, not evidence of her invisibility. Her anger was not protecting her professional interests. It was diminishing her capacity to respond skillfully to the situation. Sarah began practicing non-reaction by observing her emotional responses to James's behavior without immediately acting on them. She would notice the familiar surge of indignation, breathe with it, and ask herself, how can I respond to this situation in a way that serves my actual goals rather than just expressing my emotional reaction? This practice led Sarah to respond more strategically. Instead of getting caught up in emotional reactions to James's behavior, she began documenting her contributions more carefully, communicating her ideas more broadly within the organization, and building relationships that made her value more visible. Her non-reactive response was actually more effective at protecting her interests than her previous emotional reactions had been. The art of non-reaction is ultimately the art of freedom. When you're no longer controlled by other people's behavior, when your peace doesn't depend on external circumstances being a particular way, when you can choose your responses based on wisdom rather than reactivity, you discover a liberation that no external change in circumstances could provide. This freedom doesn't mean you become passive or accepting of harmful behavior. Non-reaction doesn't equal non-response. You can set boundaries, address problems, protect yourself, and work for positive change, all while maintaining your center and choosing your responses consciously rather than automatically. The person who has mastered non-reaction becomes a source of calm in others' storms, a place of stability in chaotic environments, a presence that others find both inspiring and soothing. They respond to aggression with strength rather than reactivity, to manipulation with clarity rather than defensiveness, to chaos with wisdom rather than panic. But perhaps most importantly, the person who has developed the art of non-reaction discovers that their happiness was never actually dependent on others being different than they are. Their peace was never really threatened by external circumstances. Their freedom was never actually in someone else's hands. This is the ultimate teaching of non-reaction, the recognition that everything you've been seeking from others, love, approval, respect, peace, has always been available within yourself. When you stop trying to get these qualities from the outside world and start cultivating them inside yourself, you become truly free. The art of non-reaction is the art of remembering who you are beneath all the roles, reactions, and identities you've constructed. It's the art of returning to your essential nature, which is consciousness itself, aware, vast, unshakable, and inherently peaceful. From this foundation, you can engage with the world skillfully and lovingly, but you're no longer at its mercy. Freedom is indeed not in controlling others, but in understanding yourself. And in that understanding lies a peace that surpasses all circumstances, a strength that cannot be shaken, and a love that embraces everything exactly as it is. Something remarkable happens when you stop fighting the mirror and start learning from it. The very people who once triggered your most intense reactions begin to serve as gentle reminders of your own humanity, patient teachers pointing you back to the aspects of yourself that still need attention and integration. What once felt like attacks on your peace become invitations to deeper self-understanding. What once seemed like obstacles to your happiness become pathways to greater wisdom and compassion. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't mean you'll never feel triggered again. But gradually, as you develop the capacity to see your emotional reactions as information rather than commands, as you learn to recognize projection when it's happening, as you practice responding rather than reacting, something profound shifts in your relationship to difficult people and challenging situations. The mirror becomes the teacher. Consider Maria's evolving relationship with her sister Elena, who had been a source of painful comparison and resentment for decades. Elena seemed to excel at everything Maria struggled with. She was confident where Maria was insecure, successful where Maria felt inadequate, effortlessly social where Maria felt awkward and self-conscious. For years, being around Elena would trigger Maria's deepest wounds around self-worth and belonging. But as Maria did the inner work of recognizing and integrating her shadow, as she learned to see her reactions to Elena as information about her own unhealed places rather than evidence of Elena's superiority, something beautiful began to emerge. Instead of Elena's confidence triggering Maria's insecurity, it began to remind Maria to access her own inner strength. Instead of Elena's success activating Maria's feelings of inadequacy, it started to inspire Maria to pursue her own goals more boldly. Elena had become a mirror that reflected not just Maria's wounds, but also her potential. The qualities in Elena that had once seemed so threatening, her self-assurance, her willingness to take risks, her ease in social situations, Maria began to recognize as aspects of herself that were simply underdeveloped rather than absent. Elena's presence began to feel less like a judgment and more like an invitation to grow into her own fullness. This shift didn't require Elena to change anything about her behavior or personality. The transformation was entirely internal to Maria, a fundamental change in how she related to her own triggers and what she made them mean about herself and others. Elena went from being Maria's unconscious enemy to being her unwitting teacher, not through any conscious intention on Elena's part, but through Maria's evolved capacity to learn from, rather than simply react to whatever activated her emotional responses. This is the essence of spiritual maturity, the ability to find your teachers everywhere, to extract wisdom from every encounter, to use every relationship as an opportunity for greater self-knowledge and growth. When you reach this level of development, no one can truly disturb your peace because you've learned to use disturbance itself as a doorway to deeper understanding. The mirror-teacher relationship works both ways. Not only do difficult people become teachers for your own growth, but you begin to recognize how you serve as a mirror for others' unconscious material. You start to see how your own behavior might be triggering others' projections, activating their unhealed wounds, reflecting back to them aspects of themselves they haven't yet learned to integrate. This recognition brings with it a profound humility and compassion. You realize that everyone is struggling with their own unconscious patterns. Everyone is working with their own unintegrated shadow material. Everyone is learning to respond rather than react to the triggers that life presents. The person whose behavior seems most unacceptable to you is likely expressing unconsciously the very qualities you've learned to express more consciously. James discovered this when he began to understand his role in the ongoing conflicts with his teenage son Michael. For months, James had been focused on Michael's disrespectful behavior, his eye-rolling, his argumentative responses, his apparent disregard for family rules and expectations. James felt justified in his frustration with Michael's attitude and behavior. But as James developed greater self-awareness, he began to recognize how his own behavior might be contributing to the dynamic. His need to be right in their disagreements, his difficulty tolerating challenges to his authority, his tendency to lecture rather than listen. These qualities were likely triggering Michael's defensive responses just as much as Michael's behavior was triggering James's reactivity. James started to see that Michael was serving as a mirror for his own unexamined relationship with power and control. Michael's rebelliousness was reflecting back to James his own suppressed need for autonomy and self-determination that had been crushed in his own adolescence. Their conflicts were not just about Michael's behavior. They were about James's unhealed wounds around authority and his unconscious recreation of the same dynamics he had experienced with his own controlling father. This recognition allowed James to approach their relationship with much greater humility and curiosity. Instead of seeing Michael as the problem to be solved, he began to see their interactions as opportunities for both of them to practice more conscious communication. Instead of focusing solely on changing Michael's behavior, James started working on his own reactive patterns and communication style. The result was a gradual softening in their relationship. As James became less reactive to Michael's challenges, Michael became less defensive and argumentative. As James learned to listen more and lecture less, Michael began to share more about his actual thoughts and feelings. As James modeled taking responsibility for his own emotional reactions rather than blaming Michael for causing them, Michael began to develop greater emotional intelligence and self-awareness. This is the miracle of conscious relationship. When you stop trying to change others and start focusing on your own growth and consciousness, the entire dynamic shifts. When you take responsibility for your own triggers and projections, rather than making others responsible for your emotional state, relationships naturally become more harmonious and authentic. The mirror teacher principle extends beyond personal relationships into every area of life. Your difficult boss becomes a teacher about your own relationship with authority and power. Your inconsiderate neighbor becomes a mirror for your own capacity for thoughtfulness and consideration. The rude stranger in traffic becomes an opportunity to practice patience and compassion rather than judgment and reactivity. This doesn't mean you have to like everyone or approve of all behavior. It doesn't require you to stay in harmful relationships or avoid setting appropriate boundaries. It simply means approaching every interaction with curiosity about what you might learn about yourself, every trigger as an opportunity to practice consciousness, every difficult person as a teacher disguised as an irritation. When the mirror becomes the teacher, you discover that your peace was never really at the mercy of other people's behavior. Your happiness was never really dependent on others being different than they are. Your growth was never really blocked by external circumstances, but only by your own resistance to learning from whatever circumstances you encountered. In this recognition lies a profound freedom, the freedom to find wisdom in every situation, to extract gold from every difficult interaction, to use every relationship as a vehicle for your own awakening. The world becomes your university, every person becomes your professor, and every moment becomes an opportunity to practice love in action. The mirror has always been reflecting your own face back to you. Now you're finally ready to smile at what you see. In the eye of a hurricane, there exists a place of perfect stillness. The winds may be raging at hundreds of miles per hour just beyond this center, destruction and chaos swirling in all directions, but in the very heart of the storm lies an island of absolute calm. This is more than just a meteorological phenomenon. It's a perfect metaphor for the state of consciousness that becomes available when you learn to find your center, regardless of what storms are raging around you. Stillness in the storm is not about avoiding life's difficulties or retreating from challenging situations. It's about discovering that place within yourself that remains unshakable, no matter what chaos emerges in your external circumstances. It's the recognition that peace is not dependent on the absence of conflict, but on the presence of awareness in the midst of any conflict. This stillness is both profoundly practical and mysteriously transcendent. It allows you to respond effectively to crisis situations because you're not consumed by emotional reactivity. It enables you to make wise decisions under pressure because your judgment isn't clouded by fear or anger. It helps you remain loving in difficult relationships because you're not being controlled by other people's behavior. Consider how this plays out in the workplace. When your boss is having a meltdown about a missed deadline, when colleagues are pointing fingers and creating drama, when the entire office is consumed with stress and conflict, the person who has cultivated stillness in the storm becomes a source of stability for everyone. They can hear what's actually being communicated beneath the emotional reactivity. They can propose solutions because they're not caught up in the problem. They can maintain perspective because they're not identified with the temporary chaos. Sarah discovered this during one of the most challenging periods in her career. Her company was going through massive layoffs, morale was at an all-time low, and her department was being restructured in ways that threatened everyone's job security. Her colleagues were consumed with anxiety, anger, and political maneuvering. The office atmosphere was toxic with fear and resentment. Initially, Sarah found herself getting pulled into the collective anxiety. She would lie awake at night worrying about her future, spend hours analyzing every corporate communication for hidden meanings, participate in endless speculative conversations with colleagues about who might be next to lose their jobs. She was being tossed around by the storm of collective reactivity. But then Sarah remembered the practices she had been developing for finding stillness within herself. She began starting each day with a few minutes of conscious breathing, grounding herself in her own center before entering the chaos of the office. She practiced observing her anxiety and fear without being consumed by them. She focused on doing excellent work rather than getting caught up in office politics and speculation. Gradually, Sarah discovered that she could remain calm and effective even as the storm raged around her. She could listen to her colleagues' concerns with compassion without taking on their anxiety as her own. She could participate in problem-solving conversations without getting pulled into blame and victimization. She could prepare for multiple scenarios without living in constant fear about the future. Most remarkably, her centered presence began to affect others. Colleagues started coming to her for perspective when they were feeling overwhelmed. Her boss began relying on her for clear thinking during crisis meetings. She became known as someone who could be counted on to remain stable and effective under pressure. This is the power of stillness in the storm. It not only protects your own peace, but becomes a gift to everyone around you. When you're not being tossed around by external chaos, you can serve as an anchor for others who are struggling to find their footing. Your calm becomes contagious. Your perspective becomes valuable. Your presence becomes healing. But stillness in the storm is not just a professional skill. It's essential for navigating the inevitable challenges of intimate relationships. When your partner is going through a difficult period, when your children are struggling with their own emotional storms, when family dynamics become tense and conflicted, your ability to remain centered becomes crucial for maintaining love and connection. Marcus learned this through his wife's battle with depression. For months, he had been reactive to her mood changes, taking her withdrawal personally, becoming frustrated with her lack of energy, feeling helpless and resentful about the impact her depression was having on their family life. His reactions were making the situation worse for everyone, adding his emotional chaos to her already difficult struggle. The transformation came when Marcus learned to find stillness within himself, even as his wife was going through her emotional storms. He practiced staying present with her pain without trying to fix it immediately. He learned to offer support without taking responsibility for her emotional state. He developed the capacity to maintain his own center while allowing her to have whatever experience she was having. This didn't mean becoming emotionally distant or uncaring. Marcus remained deeply committed to supporting his wife through her depression. But he learned to do so from a place of strength rather than reactivity, from stability rather than anxiety, from love rather than need. His stillness became a foundation that helped her find her own way back to balance. The practice of stillness in the storm begins with breath awareness. When you notice external chaos beginning to activate your internal reactivity, you can return to conscious breathing as an anchor. 3 deep breaths can create enough space between you and the situation to remember that you have a choice about how to respond. From this space of conscious breathing, you can access what spiritual traditions call witnessing consciousness, the part of you that can observe what's happening without being completely consumed by it. You can feel the stress without becoming stressed, notice the conflict without being controlled by it, experience the chaos without adding your own reactivity to the mix. This witnessing consciousness allows you to ask crucial questions. What's really needed here? How can I be most helpful in this situation? What would love do? How can I respond from my highest wisdom rather than my triggered reactivity? Sometimes the most loving response is to take action, to address problems, set boundaries, or offer practical help. Sometimes it's to simply remain present and available without trying to change anything. Sometimes it's to remove yourself from the situation while maintaining compassion for everyone involved. The key is making these choices from stillness rather than reactivity, from wisdom rather than impulse. The person who has mastered stillness in the storm becomes what Taoists call wu wei, effortless action, responding appropriately to each situation without being controlled by it. They become like water, which is soft enough to flow around obstacles, yet powerful enough to carve canyons. They embody what mystics throughout history have recognized as true power, the strength that comes from alignment with consciousness itself, rather than from resistance to what is. This stillness is not empty or lifeless. It's full of awareness, pregnant with possibility, vibrant with potential response. It's the stillness of a master musician who can play any note required by the music, the stillness of a skilled martial artist who can respond instantly to any attack, the stillness of a wise parent who can remain loving, regardless of their child's behavior. In the end, stillness in the storm is simply a return to your natural state. Beneath all the reactivity, beneath all the stories about what's wrong or right, beneath all the emotional turbulence that life can generate, there has always been this place of perfect peace within you. The storm cannot touch it because it is who you are at the deepest level, not the personality that gets triggered, not the roles you play, not the emotions you experience, but the consciousness that witnesses all of these phenomena with perfect equanimity. Finding this stillness is not an escape from life, but a return to life's essence. From this place, you can engage fully with whatever arises while never losing your center. You can love completely while remaining free. You can act powerfully while staying peaceful. You can participate totally while remaining unshakable. The storm will always pass. But the stillness at your center is eternal, beyond the realm of ego and shadow, beyond the dance of projection and reaction, beyond even the integration of light and dark. There exists what Carl Jung called the self, not the small self of personality and preference, but the capital S self that represents the totality of human potential, the archetype of wholeness, the deepest essence of what it means to be human. This self is not something you achieve or attain. It's not a destination you reach after completing your psychological work or integrating your shadow. The self is what you are at the deepest level, what you have always been, beneath all the layers of conditioning, reactivity, and unconscious identification with partial aspects of your being. The journey of individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming whole, is actually a journey of recognition, a remembering of what was never truly lost. When you operate from the self, rather than the ego, your responses to life's challenges come from a fundamentally different place. Instead of reacting from wounded patterns or defensive strategies, you respond from wholeness. Instead of being triggered by others' behavior because it threatens your carefully constructed identity, you remain centered because your sense of self is no longer dependent on external validation or circumstances. The self contains all the opposites that the ego tries to split apart. It includes your capacity for both love and anger, strength and vulnerability, wisdom and foolishness, generosity and appropriate selfishness. But these qualities are held in conscious relationship rather than unconscious conflict. You can access whatever quality is most needed in any situation without being overwhelmed by it or identified with it. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other. The self can be fierce when fierceness is called for, and gentle when gentleness serves. It can set boundaries without hatred and extend compassion without enabling. It can take action without attachment to outcomes and remain still without being passive. Maria experienced this transformation during a particularly challenging period with her elderly mother, who was struggling with advancing dementia. Her mother's condition created a constant stream of difficult situations, confusion, agitation, accusations, and behavior that required careful management and enormous patience. For months, Maria had been oscillating between two reactive patterns. Sometimes, she would become overwhelmed by the sadness of watching her mother's decline, feeling consumed by grief and helplessness. Other times, she would become frustrated and angry about the demands of caregiving, resentful about the impact on her own life and relationships. Both responses came from partial identifications, with the role of the grieving daughter or the overwhelmed caregiver. But as Maria learned to access her deeper self, she discovered a place within herself that could hold both the sadness and the frustration without being controlled by either. She could feel the grief fully while also maintaining the strength needed for practical caregiving. She could acknowledge her frustration honestly while also accessing genuine compassion for her mother's suffering. From this place of integrated wholeness, Maria could respond to each situation with whatever was most needed. Sometimes this meant advocating fiercely for her mother's needs with medical professionals. Sometimes it meant setting firm boundaries with family members who were not contributing to the caregiving but were quick to offer criticism. Sometimes it meant simply sitting quietly with her mother, offering presence without trying to fix or change anything. This capacity to respond from wholeness rather than reactivity is the ultimate fruit of all psychological and spiritual work. It represents what Jung called the goal of individuation, not becoming perfect, but becoming complete, not eliminating difficult emotions or challenging aspects of personality, but learning to work with them consciously as part of an integrated whole. The self also provides access to what many spiritual traditions recognize as the deepest truth about human nature, that consciousness itself is your fundamental identity. You are not ultimately your thoughts, emotions, reactions, or even your personality. You are the aware space in which all of these phenomena arise and pass away. From this perspective, even your most intense triggers become simply weather patterns moving through the sky of consciousness. This recognition brings with it a profound peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. When you know yourself as consciousness itself, rather than as the content of consciousness, you remain stable, regardless of what thoughts, emotions, or situations arise. You can experience anger without being angry, feel fear without being afraid, notice judgment without being judgmental. David discovered this during a period of intense conflict with his business partner, who was making decisions that David believed were harmful to their company. For weeks, David had been consumed with anxiety about the future of their business, anger about his partner's choices, and frustration about his apparent powerlessness to change the situation. But as David learned to rest in his deeper self, he realized that none of these emotional states were actually threatening his fundamental well-being. The anxiety was just anxious thoughts and sensations arising in consciousness. The anger was just angry thoughts and feelings appearing in awareness. The frustration was just frustrating mental activity occurring within the space of his being. This didn't mean the emotions disappeared, or that David became indifferent to his business situation. But he was no longer overwhelmed by the emotional content of his experience. He could feel anxious while maintaining access to wisdom. He could experience anger while also accessing compassion for his partner's perspective. He could acknowledge frustration while remaining open to creative solutions. From this place of established wholeness, David could address the business challenges more effectively. His communications with his partner became more skillful because they weren't charged with reactive emotion. His decision-making became clearer because it wasn't clouded by anxiety and anger. His capacity to find mutually beneficial solutions increased because he wasn't stuck in adversarial thinking. The self beyond shadow is not a transcendent state that exists apart from ordinary human experience. It's the deepest dimension of ordinary experience, available in every moment when you stop identifying exclusively with the surface patterns of personality and remember the vast awareness that is your true nature. This awareness is naturally peaceful, not because it avoids conflict but because it's large enough to hold all conflicts without being disturbed by them. It's inherently compassionate, not because it always agrees with everyone but because it recognizes the common humanity in all struggles. It's fundamentally free, not because it can control circumstances but because it's not dependent on circumstances for its well-being. When you operate from this self, you discover that the peace you were seeking in trying to change others was already present within you. The love you were trying to earn through perfect behavior was already your deepest nature. The wholeness you were attempting to achieve through integrating your shadow was already what you are at the most fundamental level. This recognition doesn't end the human journey or eliminate all challenges. You continue to grow, learn, and evolve. You still experience the full range of human emotions and situations. But you do so from a foundation of unshakable wholeness rather than from the fragmented reactivity of unconscious patterns. The self beyond shadow is the place where all seeking ends and all living begins. It's where you finally come home to yourself and discover that you were never actually lost. It's where you realize that every person who triggered you, every situation that challenged you, every emotion that overwhelmed you, was actually calling you back to this remembrance of your true nature. When you stop trying to control the world, you realize it was never against you. It was you, calling you home to the self you have always been, whole, aware, and inherently at peace with whatever is. That's it for today. Make sure you're subscribed for the next wild story.